Are these all the wonderful people? Yes, they are. Oh my goodness. Oh, Thomas Winn, you are looking dashing. And Chetan and Dimitri. Dimitri, I laughed so hard. How did you know we had a bouncy house on the farm, actually? How did you figure that out? He really did in that IDW video. And Chetan, good to see you. Javier, I enjoyed the negativity symposium, negative pragmatism and different things. How do you feel about that? Where's your thought at right now about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really good conversation. I think we took 3 hours to get to the point of like, are we are we letting are we orienting around lack, or are we letting lack orient us?
Hmm.
And that former question is basically like how lack has been used as a way to optimize and create efficiency in our culture. You know, you have like all these like cultural ideals of like technology detoxing and minimalism aesthetics and stuff. And it's really interesting because it's the way people are kind of taking lack and using it as a kind of way of optimizing. And yet it seems to them as a sort of counter-cultural way of counteracting. But it's actually kind of like the same principle, in my opinion.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, it was a really good conversation. I think there's still a lot to explore on that note.
Delightful. Well, I appreciate you hosting. I enjoyed it a lot. I like what the story. Man, Philip Shen, it's good to see you. I had a fun time yesterday. Well, it's interesting because Mr. Jockin was also suggesting that there's a form of lack. Also, too, let me ask you just a question on the naming. Why negativity pragmatism versus, say, lack pragmatism?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Not to
What I
put you
just
on the
like
spot, like any name you pick. Like I picked belonging again, which is due tomorrow, and I'm like, was belonging the right word for this weird historical episode? So there's no perfect language, but if I were to throw that at you,
yeah, I mean, I just like the negative part, mainly because I don't know. I think I want to be like one. I want it to be about lack, but then I also want to think negative, and that's a very obviously very abstract and woo woo term kind of right now. But I want to be able to think the negative without the positivity, right? Like put the positivity as the limitation. And that's something that's very hard to think. And that's why I'm using like a lot of like Julie Resch's work, because it does kind of force kind of like interesting avenues of thought that we wouldn't typically lean towards. And so I'm kind of creatively doing that. But then also at the same time, I'm not limiting anybody else to doing that. I want to see the kind of permutations and shades of negative pragmatism that we could come up with. You could say what I've come up with, that's what I have done. But everybody else in that conversation has contributed, you could say, to a certain shade of negative pragmatism.
mm. No, very nice. And, I like how you're being negative about the negative pragmatism to negate that as well, to be open for other people, because now we have room for annihilating pragmatism or lack pragmatism and all these beautiful things. So that's wonderful. And no, as you know, I'll talk about the phenomenology of lack or phenomenological pragmatism and what if because of our experience, we have reason to think that the conditions of reality are X, what would be the adequate practice relative to thinking the conditions of reality are such, and that's why we can experience things that way. But the thing I was actually, Mr. Jockin was getting at this idea that there are some, like lack is dangerous, right? There are ways by which we can engage with lack that leads to the shadows or privation in an Aquinas sort of sense. But then there's also this way of lack that seems to be approaching beauty or heading toward the partial object. And so the question becomes, what is the right way to be toward lack, or in this sense, that doesn't lead to these pathological responses or these different problems or different things? And I wonder if actually a lot of it, and maybe Mr. Ebert will feel this when I talk about it, is the encounter or the surprise, is the limit that is an image versus limit that's a product of a surprise or an encounter with limit, or like coming on it. Because there is this kind of idea of the orbit around lack, right? Versus the thinking of lack. Like the moment you think lack, it takes on an image and then it could be a privation, right? Or it could have a negative consequence. Whereas if we think about negative pragmatism, almost to me, has something to do with the pragmatism of binding yourself to a situation where surprise is possible. Because that also seems really important here. Like you have to be like creating a space of a negative pragmatism or such, or annihilation, or removing presuppositions for the freeing of speech, as we were saying the other evening when I kept Thomas Winn for 5 hours because he's a saint, he's all dressed for it now, what a guy, is that there seems to be this committed to a space where something that you can't predict can occur. Like that kind of thing, right? And so the lack then is what's lacking is the thing that will surprise you from your framework, right? And that then makes me think of like when we talk about Dante as the unveiling, what would it look like to have practices? And here's the key. If the thing you are optimizing for is a surprise, that always kind of leaves open a certain excess that you cannot frame within your personal optimization because you don't exactly know what the thing is that's going to surprise you, right? And so instead, there seems to be something on kind of the idea of creativity, because I've been thinking as well, like we talked about the virtual, actual, and potential, because, you know, I wanted to get as crazy as possible again, is on this idea, and I've been looking at Deleuze on the notion of faced with various intensities, what is the virtual that we consider for the creation of those intensities? And I wonder if there's something about orbiting lack, if we use that language from Jockin or that we've talked about before, if that's a kind of building up of, there's something about that, that in the negation of optimization, you're building the potential of intensity and creativity. Like you're kind of almost building up the ability to create. And the problem with optimization, this is what I'm wondering, is there something about optimization in the world today that in the name of optimizing results, it removes creative possibility, which in this Deleuzian, Bergson, Barthian like sense that we were talking about last week is creativity. Like if indeed in the actual, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, if indeed there's something in the actual that is animated, meaning the potential and the actual are together in this kind of vibrancy, vitalism, this actuality is moving. And the virtual is the ability to consider the possibilities of that unfolding that the human subject can add. Then there's something about the orbiting of the lack being the ability to actually build up the creativity or have the creative potential to increase the range of that virtual unfolding. And so I wonder if there's something about the problem, and then I'll give it back to you, Javier, if there's something about the problem with optimization is that it actually removes from you the capacity, one, to handle surprise, and basically to be creative in terms of virtuality. And the reason for that is because optimization has a very clear metric, so you're not very imaginative. You're not very creative, right? Because it's like, oh, this is what we need to do to optimize, right? You know, this is what the society says. So there's something about optimization that seems to get in the way of the virtual, that also seems to get in the way of orbiting. Because if you think about it, orbiting is very suboptimal. You're just going around something, right? Ebert's suboptimal. We talked about menti-divergent to escape Nash equilibria. There's something about that orbiting that has a certain suboptimal to it that seems to condition the subject in that orbiting of lack to be more capable of virtual possibility and to handle surprise. And so the weird thing, it's almost like negative pragmatism. You're negating the pragmatism for the sublation and the conditioning to be able to handle surprise or creative possibility. More needs to be said, but let me give it to you, Javier, and then Philip. Javier, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Like, this is the whole problem. If we think from the point of failure, the point of failure is this: what do we do when we're not optimizing? Like, that's the question. Like, nobody knows. Like, we don't even know how to think that question. Like, that's the problem. Because then the other temptation is, well, then we just optimize for the surprise, right? And that's why I like the negative as the limit without going to that positivity, because it's really hard to think without already going. And actually, I think I was watching one of your talks, I think was with Espacea, where you talked about like what's dangerous about like certain things. It's like it's really quick to like a utilitarianism kind of concept, right? Like it easily falls into like a utilitarianism, like what's the use of it? And you could say lack use really is a kind of like just negative idea of just like surprise. What do we do when we get surprised? Which is like a really awkward question to ask. Should I prepare for it? There's a certain degree of preparation that would be required, but then there's also this idea of like you're never prepared for the surprise because it's precisely a surprise, right? So yeah, I mean, I think the conversation needs to go into these questions of what do we do because it seems like the answer is always like, okay, well then how do we optimize it? And that's what I want to put that as the limit. Like let's not try to optimize. How do we think let's, not optimization? And that seems actually really difficult to think through, which is why I got everybody on this project basically. But yeah, it's enough for me.
Well, Aspasia is outstanding, and Thomas Winn, those are beautiful comments. And I think that question on optimization, I would say, Chiton, is basically pragmatism, utility. How do you optimize your day to make the most of it in different things? One of the things I wonder, though, is it almost like the moment, like, is there a different, when we talk about optimizing a surprise, does the function of the word optimize really work there? Is that really optimization? Or is it kind of fittingness, right? Like, what's the difference between proving able to fit or meet something unexpected, or to not be like escaping the real? Because there also could be a dangerous where, if in a sense we say all optimization is bad, not to necessarily push back on what you're saying, Javier, because I think you're correct that today there's this obsession with optimization that, to use my language, would fall into Nash equilibrium and suboptimal results. But there's another danger where, if all optimization is bad, is there a sense to reference Ms. Resch where that's too positive? Because then we know what to do. Just don't optimize. You're good to go, right? And also, then to be suboptimal, you can't be anti-optimal, can you? And this is where it's really weird. Like, the problem I have sometimes with, like, if we take a bad nihilism, to reference Nietzsche, is that you basically have the word nihilist be good, or what you're supposed to do, even if good is not like in a happy sense. It's like, you know what to do. But in that can smuggle a presupposition. And we were talking about at the Net 93, where the philosopher is always in this clearing, questioning the presupposition till you keep going and you keep going. So what's interesting is, it almost seems to me, and then I'll pass it to Philip, Dimitri, and then Chiton, is it's almost like the negative pragmatism, in order to be negative pragmatism, has to entail within itself a certain annihilation of its own negativity, to keep the movement going, to keep the orbiting going. And that's what's hyper weird. But then at the same time, and I'll give it to Philip and Chiton, Dimitri, if you want to speak, please. What's interesting is that also, in a more optimistic way, may mean the philosopher always has a role. Because if you can never just say negative good or annihilating good, it depends. It's always the particular, which actually gets to a wonderful comment Jockin had about the movement from the general to the particular, but I'll abstain. Then there's always a role for the philosopher, or I was speaking with Joel, of the elder, to sort of gauge these different things and presuppositions. I'd be curious your response to that, Javier. I'll first pass it to Philip and Chiton. Philip, it is good to see you again, sir.
Ditto, brother. I wonder if there's another part of optimization that can kind of be framed like imitation, because generally what it is the people that have figured out, they're like, oh, I figured out a way for, I don't know, for like however long you're gonna do this next thing, like how to do it best. So I'm thinking about it in the sense that it's like somehow you're aping something, whether or not you have the ideal fully fleshed out. And it reminds me somewhat of like not recognizing that a lot of the way that we're measuring things scientifically is still within a Laplacian probability paradigm. So it could be that like this optimization works for a bunch of people. It might even work for you. But I think maybe there's a bigger question of like how might wisdom be used to know when to imitate and when not to? When it's wise to be like, oh, I should do this like the elders, and when I shouldn't. And I think the answer is neither is 100%. So formulating it then becomes like really contextually specific, and getting to a point where you recognize just how much you imitate may open some curiosity for the suboptimal. Because in a way, like if you're not imitating, it's probably gonna be seen by a lot of people as suboptimal, but it might get you to this I think it's Heidegger who calls it der Stille, this sort of like ringing silence, where all of a sudden like you let everything go, and then something emerges that could only emerge with your particularity?
I'm really taken by the notion that most optimization is just imitation. And so what, in a sense, then the optimization that we see in the culture is an imitation. And what's actually, in a sense, optimization would be optimizing for something you don't know, like the hope that Javier was saying that you don't know, right? Which then that means you're optimizing for something that's not generalizable, but must be found in the particular and the partial object, right? Which is found in the ability to meet the unexpected. That's why it's interesting to me. Is it lack without limit, or encounter seems to be what leads to these shadows? Because it always just comes back to Plato, doesn't it? Shadows on the wall. So optimization as imitation is just a kind of shadow on the wall. But let me go, and then I'll give it to Chiton and Dimitri. So I'm interested. Mr. Jockin will join us. So Chiton, please, and then Dimitri.
So problem is, I understand goes like this. Please correct me, because it's not something that I have read a lot about. And as I said, optimization at a certain threshold is a question of calculation, beyond which it becomes something else. And we are trying to sort of identify at what threshold this switch happens. Because as you said, Nash equilibrium problem is exactly this, that at a certain point, to look for optimization itself gives you suboptimal results. So at a certain point, to optimize itself means to let go of optimization. So in a certain way, optimization as a problem cancels itself out. Can you see the structure here? That it works up to a point and then retroactively cancels itself out. Retroactively, if you will only aim for optimization, things will you will only get suboptimal results all the time. And after that point, you need other ways of optimizing than calculation. So in many ways, it's a problem when it's one of those questions that when you bring into focus in isolation, in some senses, it will always retroactively cancel its own ground in that sense. And then you're again left with nothing. And I think given those conditions, I would go with Javier's answer. I would go with negative. I would let go of this old positive urge and say, okay, let's go the other way in that case, and see that when we are not optimized, doesn't mean we don't optimize at all. Of course, that's not the point. Point is that what is it about optimization that we have to function at what threshold we have to function completely without holding its ground. We have to forget that optimization can give us the ground upon which any future movement is possible. What is that threshold about? And at a certain threshold, Javier would probably argue, and I will not go to Javier's extent probably, but Javier would probably argue and ask us to argue, think that at what threshold we have to completely let go of that ground. And then we may have to have a fresh discussion with him without actually making optimization as a counter current to what he's saying. I guess. I'm not sure. I think he'll be a better way to say it, but that's my rough thoughts around it. Yeah.
No, that's outstanding. I'll give it to Dimitri. And Thomas Jockin, it is good to see you, sir. We were talking a bit, as you were talking about, on the kind of where there's a danger with lack. And something I was thinking about is lack as kind of image outside the encounter seems to be very dangerous versus lack that's found in the encounter with, say, the partial object. And if there's something about, is it lack without the encounter of limit? That's to reference kind of Mr. Ebert's or freak theory or different things, the encounter with the partial object from our talk, that seems to be positive and has to lead to that orbiting structure you were talking about as well. That seems really important versus lack that is a mere image. And then that would almost be like the dangerous lack that can lead to the privation or all these problems is the lack that is in the general. That seems to also follow with the optimization, where then negativity seems to be positive because you are talking about you lead to all these problems of calculation, and that seems to move you away from the partial object, which would then mean that calculation would not be in service of, say, the encounters of beauty or the possibilities of, say, the orbiting structure. And that's where the negativity becomes very, very important. So we're talking a bit about that, and I will pass it to Dimitri and then Javier. Dimitri, please.
Yes, welcome to the intellectual dig web. It was a great collaboration. I'm very excited was very excited to release it, and we had some discussion amongst the collaborators if we were really gonna release it, because it was euphemistically to say it euphemistically quite polemic, right? So and political too. For example, like when I posted this in the Philosophy Portal Facebook group, nobody gave it a like. But I know people clicked the link because it has like 150 views by now. And people were like spamming me with like messages about, I mean, it's kind of crazy. I never got so much positive feedback from a project. Never. People were fawning all over it. And I'm not even like being hyperbolic here. I know you guys maybe know me like a hyperbolic person, but I'm not. I mean, someone said it's the best piece of philosophy from the IDW in years. Tears of laughter, like people, yeah, they were fawning all over it. And that's interesting because, you know, what's this thing like humor? Like we were talking about surprise and lack and all these kinds of things. People were laughing so much about it and telling me things, and it really made something loose. And I think the power of humor is really to reveal the unconscious too, and the unconscious speech, you know, because there's also, I will not mention his name if you're in the IDW still, get out of there. But no, for real, like there was a guy who responded that, oh God, I wish I would have been in the video. Now I think he was sarcastic, but I'm not sure. But either way, like if he was sarcastic or not, he speaks the truth of his desire. That much is clear. Because that's how he's quilted himself, right? Yeah, so this is the dimension for me to bring out, you know, like what are the ways in which we do philosophy? Because it's a philosophical project. Yes, it's also an art project, but it's even more like a philosophical project. And I mean, what I just told you guys, like, I mean, nobody expected this project to be released. I didn't even expect it like a while ago, but it did happen. And yeah, and like I said, publicly there's silence, absolute silence. But in my DMs, if you read my DMs, I mean, I already told you, people are like, oh my God, this and that. So what is that? Why does that happen? You know, I put myself out there and show it. I mean, it's an unlisted video because I know people are not going to understand it and they don't have to watch it. I don't want to force it down people's throats. But what is that happening? You know, people absolutely love it in DM. Publicly, they don't want to acknowledge it. You know, I'm not saying, oh, I want to be publicly acknowledged or something. But this is the stakes of the digital politics, you know. This is the stakes of, there's things happening behind, you know, the videos and things that we talk about in DMs, in maybe private emails or something that's not being talked about publicly. And my video kind of exploded this and like revealed the dynamics latent. So I mean, the way you will relate to the video is either gonna be maybe you're gonna be repulsed, but most likely you're gonna love it and you're gonna find it absolutely hilarious. There were also people who were repulsed and absolutely detested it, but there was no one who was like indifferent to it, and that's why it was a huge success to me. You know, not only artistically but also politically, because it showed the dynamics of surprise. And when we talk about the phenomenology of the artist or the philosopher, it also reveals a lot. Because I worked on this project basically to edit the final bits and pieces for 3 days. I think I worked on it like 20 hours straight. It's like I was going insane with it. I learned video editing on the spot, so you will see what the result of that is if you decide to watch it. But yeah, this is kind of a wild project also in terms of the drive and the drive optimization, because you know, when I started video editing this project, I had so much to do, but I was like, let me just like distract myself while and editing the final bits and pieces of this project. But that turned out to be the very thing that my drive like latched onto in this in this manner that was like uber playful and like also very like very strong. And this is like the strength of play to me, you know, when you are in this playful flow state, you can learn so much because you're absolutely focused. So that made me think about simplicity. And Daniel, you kind of implicitly pointed to my thought on this, because there's this idea that masculinity is all about simplicity, the virtue of simplicity. And I completely, utterly agree with this. But we have to add one little thing, and that is that it's always simplicity with its excess. And this is where it happens. Because if you don't have this access, you're gonna get crazy, like with this simplicity. You're in this rotary motion, doing the same thing over and over. And like when you like move out of it and you so-called distract yourself, to me personally, that's where my best projects come from. Like this one, for example. So it's, yeah, this project really has I still feel like the afterwaves after like publishing it, not only like having made it, but also all the different kind of responses from people. So with that, from that being said, yeah, I'm glad to introduce something new to the scene, or the let's call it the scene to milieu process, and like to see how can people enjoy the scene to milieu process, because that's the stake of political interventions like this, if we want to call it that, or at least interventions political insofar as it's gonna be provocative, and also this piece of art forces you to take a stance towards it, even if you don't want to publicly acknowledge it. So with that being said.
No, I appreciate. No, it brings to mind quite a lot for me, because, and I'll pass it to Javier, because a lot of what we're concerned about, you could say the problem of belonging again to, is this notion of game theory dynamics and the problem of spread. And here's the issue. One of the key kind of notions is hermeneutic binding. And the more you spread, the more you have less binding of the possible interpretation. So when I'm in a small group, and I know that everyone likes this kind of humor of the intellectual dick web, for example, then I know I can share it, and I don't have to risk anything, because there's a certain sort of parameter of the kind of expectation I can expect, because I kind of know the people. Yeah, the Dante spinning around frantically really made me happy. It was really funny. So you have a certain hermeneutic binding. And this is kind of the big problem that can happen with small intentional communities, is because, say, like I was speaking with Cadell and Michelle about this, is that if you have a small game D community and people join, then it is extremely likely it's relatively self-selected, because it's not usual that people would move to a community like that, or they would have the housing or the economic variability to do something like that, right? So if they do, there's probably going to be a certain relative binding, not a tight binding, but a pretty relative binding to the worldview that's present there and the ways people interpret, right? And that's why a small intentional community, the terms is, it's the difference between system and negotiation. The smaller the community, the more you can probably run it just by negotiation, meaning you can talk together. And that speaking is probably not going to be extremely painful, because you have a relative sense of what the people think around you, right? The danger is speaking publicly to people that you don't know, and who knows how they're going to take it, and what if they're mad, right? But if I have a binding, a smaller community, I'm pretty safe to speak. The larger the scale, the more you are bringing in people who may not necessarily share your worldview. And you see what that means is that in order for it to continue to work, negotiation is going to become increasingly difficult, to the point where it actually can become impossible. And so you say, well, we need a system. And a system is something that works without the human element. It just works, like, let's say, markets or capital, right? The glory of a system is that it works regardless the human element, meaning that you can hate it and it still works. You don't have to like it. You could despise it, it could still work. But the horror of a system is that it works without the human element. That's both the glory and the horror, right? That you don't have to have the human element. And what ends up happening is that the more and more you scale, or you put something out publicly, like a book or a video, and you don't know what all the people think of it and what they think of it, you know, you saying something about it is entering something that you don't have any hermeneutical binding about, which leads to a Nash equilibria of no response publicly, or everyone doing it discreetly, which is actually, in a sense, a rational move of people to do if they do not know what the outcome could be, right? And so here's the problem. Those game theory dynamics that the video outlines are what appear as you scale a project. But once you start to scale the project and they appear, because you probably started the project or the community on grounds of negotiation, you're not prepared for those dynamics at all. I thought we were all together. And then silence, and it falls apart, right? And those kind of dynamics are what tend to appear as you scale, because, for example, it was mentioned last week. You're not going to talk about negative pragmatism with your grandma, right? She's not going to know what it means. I'm not even going to talk, like, even people who say around me, who I know their political beliefs, for example, I'm going to be wise about talking about them because I might think I know what their political beliefs mean, but then maybe it doesn't, right? And so you don't have a clear sense of the hermeneutical binding, meaning the range of interpretation of language or terms or what things mean. And that results in people naturally doing what? Withdrawing, because it's too much trouble or it's too much risk, right? When people don't know or have a sense of the outcome, and you have more and more pluralistic or diverse variables involved, that then leads to a not sure of the risk-benefit analysis, so why would you take the risk? Because you don't have a sense of the risk having any possibility of value, right? So it's rational not to do it, right? So I think what you're describing with the video brings out those dynamics that tend to happen too when people they may talk about being a communist or a capitalist or a business person with their friends, but then when it comes to doing it publicly, they're like, no, I'm not going to talk about that, because most people, when they hear, for example, most people, my reading of the beginning of The Capital with Karl Marx, seeing him as a sociologist, my reading of Marx is not what the majority of people talk about when they talk about Marxism, right? So I have to know that and be aware that bringing up Marx is automatically going to be fitted into a certain interpretation of Marx that is there because I don't have any binding principle to the hermeneutics, right? So you're aware of that. So you have to ask yourself the question, is it really worth it to bring up Marx in this context or not, given the risk-benefit analysis? And that all depends on your audience. And you eat all you like, Dimitri. That is no issue. So you're aware of that. But here's the funny thing. What results in the inaction is from an uncertainty of the possible risk, benefit, reward, right? It becomes, you don't know what it is. But we've been saying up to now, and then I'll give it to Javier and Philip, and Javier, if you want to speak, please, is that we're talking about a hope that doesn't know its end, an optimization that doesn't know what it's optimizing toward. We're talking about a lack. What is the difference between the unknown of a cost-benefit analysis that leads to not acting and a lack that you actually need to orbit that has some sort of conditioning of the subject in a certain positive way, right? How do you tell those differences? And here's the question. Is the probability of people orbiting a lack or an unknown far, far more difficult on a large scale? That seems to be true, because on a smaller scale, you can orbit an unknown, but because you have a certain sense of the range of interpretation or responses, then even if you don't know the outcome, the outcome can only be but so bad, right? You're not going to have people never talk to you again, right? Because you have that hermeneutical binding. But as you get to a larger stage and you're let's orbit an unknown, well, you have no idea. What if your boss is watching this and your boss hears you talking about Marx and then he fires you? Are you an idiot? You see what I'm saying? So this is the issue. So you have a scaling problem here that brings out different dynamics that are tied to hermeneutical binding that then the cost-benefit analysis leads people to acting in certain ways. And so that too, also the problem of optimization or calculation seems to have something to do with the scale and the hermeneutic binding of the people who would be seeing the material, the transparency and different things. So these have to be taken into account, but let me give it to Javier and then Philip. Javier Rivera.
Yeah, so I guess I'll clarify. I guess I'll clarify more of my position because I haven't actually been clarifying it too much. So yes, I think Chetan kind of phrased it pretty well in terms of, so I'm not against, for example, I'm not against optimization and I'm not against pragmatism as such. I'm not going to moralize this and be like, that's bad, let's never do that. My concern is precisely the fact that we only have a relation to optimization and pragmatism, right? This is the only relation we have with lack, basically, right? How do we deal with lack? Well, we optimize it, right? We close the distance between lack, right? We try to lack less. You could say that's exactly the optimize. That to me, that's the optimization point. How do we lack less? And then there's the other point where it's for example, the aesthetics of practicing minimalism, right? It's stripped completely of its religious context, is really interesting because then it's okay, well then how do we maximize lack? Okay, now that's another interesting problem because then it's all right, so what are we doing here? We're closing the distance between lack, but then there's this other temptation where we try to maximize lack. This idea of Let's do detoxes. Let's try all these like fads and diets. Let's let's quit the internet. Let's take cold showers. This is really interesting because it seems to still not get at, in my opinion, what I'm talking about with negative pragmatism. It may be actually, and it's actually very close to what Jockin was already getting at, which is there seems to be multiple thresholds here in terms of there's the optimization, which I define as closing the distance between lack. Then there's the other optimization of lack where we try to maximize it. But to me, that's still the same kind of logic that is predicated on the closing of lack. I guess you could say the lack that I'm trying to talk about is very similar to the surprise, right? When the optimization, whether you are minimizing or maximizing the lack, when it breaks that threshold, and then you have to have a different relation to lack. And that is fundamentally what negative pragmatism is. Now, the question is, you're bringing up very good things, Daniel, because the question that you're bringing up is, okay, the problem of scale. And that's a good question to ask. And then, basically what I want to bring to the table is, what are the different possible relations to lack that we can have that isn't in the sphere of maximizing or minimizing it? How do we do that? Can we do that? Is there only one other option to relating to lack that isn't between these two? This is why I'm not settled on negative pragmatism being the answer. This is why I like the shades of relations that we're trying to come up with to negative pragmatism, because I do think there's other ways to think about it, but the question is how? And I think we're at a really standstill because we are really thinking hard here in terms of okay, we've been doing these kind of relationships to lack for a very long time. And so it's really like kind of undoing our brain a little bit here and getting us to think. But yeah, that's all I got to say.
No, that's delightful, and I'll pass it to Philip. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I think a lot, like we talked about with the Ivan Illich course at Parallax, and the idea of the unarmored test based on Owen's work on the notion of, it used to be classically what was masculine, for example, or thematic, was going on the battlefield without armor. Like if you had a bunch of armor, then that actually in a way showed a lack of ability because you needed armor, right? So the question that's kind of interesting there is that what would be truly thematic, which may have something to do with a kind of releasement or annihilation, as Mr. Winn is putting in the comments, is the notion of going into battle without armor. But then what's interesting, so there's a kind of negative there, a kind of annihilation of armor, but it's precisely to be open to the surprise. Because if you're wearing armor, you're not open to the surprise. So here's the question. Is being ready for surprise too positive, to use Ms. Resch's language? Is that too much of an optimization, or is it the right balance, quote unquote? The right fittingness, because balance seems to be wrong, because it seems to be all language is wrong, I suppose, except fluffy kitten. We'll just talk about fluffy kitten. That will be the language. That's the form. There seems to be the language that we seem to need is something that describes, as Mr. Jockin was sharing with me, and I think it's well put because it makes me think of my beloved Dante, as the video brought out. Thank you so much, Dimitri. Is what does it mean to orbit lack? And orbit in a manner that's building intensity in the Deleuzian sense, or it has an intensity to it to make you more capable of the virtual or to the imaginative, so that you can participate in the unfolding of the actual according to the potential that is integrated into the actual. And Mr. Jockin also shared me a fantastic idea or point that he was making, where classically for Aristotle, and if I get this wrong at all, Mr. Jockin, please correct me, is the notion that if you are actually a human being from that general category, there's a certain potential that comes with that, because a human is capable of rational faculties, but then the individual Daniel decides when they apply that that energy, that rationality to a particular circumstance. So what's interesting is there's a potential that comes, and I know there are different words classically that you were sharing that I cannot pronounce because I'm incapable of English, let alone classical language, is there's a certain potential that comes with the nature per se of being human, which then makes the potential of the agent to apply that in a particular circumstance. So it's interesting to think that there's kind of two levels, but one of those potentials is completely, well, both of those potentials are completely inseparable from the actuality. Ergo, like we were saying last week, we can't talk about potential as separate from actuality, but it's interesting to think of the timing of that action of that potential in accordance of the particularity of persons that seems to have something to do within the virtual, ergo their imagination, the ability to think that, oh, this is fitting, right? Is that all a kind of ontology of optimization, or at that point are we beyond it? Because it doesn't seem like any of that can be calculated. It has to be participated in. I wonder, this would be the question to Chetan's excellent point, is participation the opposite of calculation? Is participation the opposite of calculation? Like if you have to participate in something, is that really calculation anymore? Or is that readiness? Or is that there-ness? Is that, and it would seem like participation as such would get into radical annihilation, releasement, because all the things that Heidegger and Mr. Winn can correct me on this, all of these things of what we need to annihilate and release are all these things that are taking us out of the here, the grace of here, like the there. We can let be because there's a there. There's a here. So we can let be and it's here, and then we can participate in it. And so that seems to be kind of opposite of calculation. And the funny thing is then if that is what is participation in the orbit per se, which would then be the orbiting of a partial object, and the lack is linked to a particularity that is ever deepening according to beauty, following the conversation Jockin and I had, that then seems to be, that would be the language of the orbiting. And that would seem to be different from the calculation. But the problem is the more you scale, which then gets into the whole other question that we don't have to go to, it seems very, very difficult to scale without losing the releasement by definition because of the problem of hermeneutic binding. Because you don't know if you may be there, but are they there? Right? How do you know if they are there, like you are there, if they're releasing like you're releasing, and there's a certain, and yet that vulnerability seems to be the prerequisite for a certain depth of love or a certain depth of beauty. That seems to be really, really important. So there's a vulnerability here. There's more to say, but let me pass it to Philip Thomas and then Mr. Jockin. So Philip Shen.
As far as the participation goes, I think it depends on what you're participating in, because the market is actually full of calculations. That is to say, as we self-instrumentalize, I wonder what your example of the boss, like, you probably are an idiot and you're also poor. So like, God damn it. So like
It's called your boss is calling. Your boss is watching. He's calling.
No, I wonder so much of what you're saying. I don't really know what this word releasement means, but I kind of like it. And I'm gonna use it of like the releasement of status anxiety, which is like, okay, Dimitri has a certain status. Maybe he is like the brave court jester or something like this, and he ruffled some of the royalty's feathers or something. And there really is something like cool if, you know, people don't get economically defenestrated for pointing out some truths that people don't want to talk about. But I think you enter that dialectic of like truth and care. And so often who you're speaking with may have some say over your material conditions. So you veer away from truth and you're like, okay, how can I really say things that, you know, care for this person?
Or even the potential, even you're even if you just think that they have some say in it. They don't even have to have a say in it factually or actually, but you thinking that they might in the future maybe already exerts efficacy.
Oh, well, and that's an even deeper hole to fall in, because that's like
we're in this shit all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's everyone at all times. This is Schopenhauer and the porcupine thing, right? And like, how then do you advance conversation? If it is always like, you know, it becomes, I think it might lead to what Javier's talking about, like actually very addictive behavior. Because you're like, fuck it, I can't get like anything like true or virtuous, but I can hit the pleasure button by taking my cold shower, by waking up at 4:30, by slinging steel, like whatever. And if I just like repeat those things day in, day out, I'll never have to think that I'm not doing the exact right thing. I'll never have to worry. And I'll get all the validation, you know, from certain status trackers. And I'll also have a script. every single time I meet someone, I'll know what to say. I'll know where they stand. But it does call for sort of a turnkey totalitarianism, a la Arendt, that doesn't allow you to be yourself, really, or be non-imitative. So that's sort of a deadlock either way you look.
No, that's excellent. I'll pass it to Thomas Winn and Thomas Jockin. You know, on what Dimitri's point there, in blowing again, when we talk about meta mentality, is the idea of now we're always thinking. Meta mentality is when you don't simply go, it's like, I think, you think, I think, you think, not merely I think, you think, but I think, you think, they think, and it's endless, like, what is everyone thinking? That leads to this kind of chaos and anxiety, and eventually people say, screw it, I'm going to take my cold shower and not think about other people. And in one way, it's really good not to think about what other people think. And in another way, it's really terrible not to think about what other people think, right? That's the problem with systems. It's wonderful in a way that capitalism works regardless if people like it or not. In another way, it's completely terrible that capitalism works whether people like it or not, right? This is the problem. And also, like you're saying, like, it seems to be that the problem of scale has something to do with scaling automastery versus automatism. Because what we've done is scaled automatism. What would it mean to scale automastery? You would have a similar effect, but it would seem to be different in quality, right? Now, that was very vague and would have to be expanded, but there's something about automastery that has a isomorphic similarity to the automatic, but yet a different quality. In the same way that the hand that held a pen and doesn't is different from the hand that never held a pen. It looks like the same hand, but there's different from the active, dare I say, releasement. And Mr. Winn will tell you what releasement means because it's such a beautiful term. And there's something then about the automastery that, but then the question becomes the location of the automastery. And perhaps you made a very good point on participating in a generality. Maybe there's a difference between participation and something abstract and something particular, like a particular participation in a particular, well, I'll talk about common life with David Hume, et cetera, so forth, but kind of particular participation that leaves you open for the surprise of the other. And Clayton, it's good to see you, sir. You're a saint. And I wonder if that's part of it as well. This kind of participation in the particular that has a counterfeit in this participation of something larger than yourself that you only relate to abstractly without the partial object that you relate to as a definition or a totality versus a definitive and an infinity, to kind of combine some of the language Jockin and I used, and then a little bit of Levinas there. I will pass it to Mr. Winn and then Mr. Jockin. Mr. Winn.
I'm just semi-laughing at Dimitri's joke about releasement as letting you lease an apartment. But it's interesting because I think it kind of connects straight back to what Javier said at the beginning, because I missed the conversation on negative pragmatics, which I wanted to get to. But I think it's kind of gone full circle in the sense of what Dimitri's introduced and everything, because I haven't seen the video. So I'm outside of the community. I'm outside of the perspective of, sorry to say. But I think this is always the question, and actually, like, this is kind of a potential trajectory for my future research, is the question of how the way in which we approach community or complexes or societies or systems or modalities of being where we have status, you know, like inevitably we have status in the sense that we are working class, middle class, subject to dynamics of anything. I think the question is, I think I made a note basically based upon what Dimitri says. Like I said, like, I don't know the ins and outs of this system, like this community. Isn't it the case that the dynamic behind any community or complex is always situated from differing standpoints that assume that their systematic approach fits? And when you said the word fits, Daniel, and where each subject desires to optimize what fits, I think this is the problem. Like, each time that anyone participates in a community, there's always perspective, there's always interpretation. Like you said, there's like the hermeneutic framework in which we live and move. But I think this comes towards releasement, like releasement as the idea that I know that in any community I have my ideas, but are my ideas based upon, like, how are they based? Do I assume that my ideas, especially when it comes to philosophical communities, I have my philosophy, you know, like I have my way of experiencing things. And of course, I'm open to other perspectives. But if I'm creating a community and there are differing perspectives, then it gets to the point where there's such a tension between perspectives. But the question is like, how is your philosophy based? If I'm assuming that I know absolute knowing as it is, which is part of my philosophy, what is it that absolute knowing is? Like, how do I ground it? Am I assuming that, like, yeah, like let it be? Like, so basically this comes back to it. Like I said, and this is like the Heideggerian motive from his middle period, where he says the only thing that we can ever do in the indeterminacy of ideas, or what seems to be indeterminacy, is to realize that we don't always have to achieve what we thought we did within a specific community, within a specific metaphysical problem. Because at what he called the end of metaphysics, there's a groundlessness to my ideas. So this is why Heidegger was like a key figure for hermeneutics, like the philosophy of interpretation, because they became like this movement of ideas which said, well, at least in terms of the history of how we've approached knowledge, there is this non-rational side, which means that I realize that there's a kind of limit to my knowing. And at that point, at that juncture where I can't do what I expected to have done, I encounter a lag. What is there to do? So Heidegger's middle period is about releasing that desire or that will or that drive to like substantially attain something, to like sorry, I forgot the name. Philip, like status, like the status of who you think you are, what you should be. That desire to maintain yourself as an ego image in that community, I think Heidegger's middle period would say there is nothing that you can do. Release, like realize that what you're aiming for is inevitably lacking, and it goes back to the pragmatism. But then this is the question: what remains? Do we turn to pragmatic ideas? No, I think we can still encounter truth and truth in communities. Then this is the point. As I said, like, release and see what happens. Ideas still move, and so systems still subject people or things. But how are they moving? What are they presupposing and grounding themselves upon in their approach to what fits? How does the quality of the language of the orbit come forth in its presuppositions? Does it assume that it has approached a quality of ontological grounding, which rests on that which cannot be released, like will, desire? Does it desire status, or does it constantly rest with the motive of a kind of negative pragmatics, which lets each perspective be, as long as, and this is the ethics of releasement actually, as long as such perspectives also let each other perspective be, instead of having constrained dynamics, control, somebody who thinks they know what they're doing at the top. And like you can think, like this goes back to our conversation from last time about like the church and the way the church approaches knowledge. Like it assumes from the get-go that it has a kind of presuppositionless perspective where it's in contact with God's own truth. And so anything that it puts into the community is grounded. And when you approach that type of community with that quality of knowledge, there's no space to let the person be, because you have already pre-assumed what they are or who they are or their status, you know, like insider, outsider, Christian, sinner. I think philosophy for Christianity is to always release, but not to the point where we just kind of say, well, there's just interpretations that we can pragmatically use, which is part of my PhD. Like there's a philosopher who would say this, and I like his work. Savatimo says he is a pragmatist, you know. But I think there's also still, and this is Hegel, this is the later Heidegger, within indeterminacy, within this space of the clearing, when we release things, we actually realize that we still can have communities and philosophies that do encounter truths. But those truths are always about kind of letting someone be, especially when it comes to politics. And so, for example, like, I'm not sure about the IDW. I think I'm on the emailing list, actually. I see it sometimes. But the idea is like, if in that community there are those people who are very strong-minded about what is true or how you should approach that setting, then of course they're controlling, choking, like subduing perspectives. And the idea is, well, if at the end of the day it's philosophy, then philosophy, Daniel, is like free speech, you know? It's the freeing of speech in that sense. Yeah.
No, that's magnificent. And as you were speaking, and then I'll pass it to Mr. Jockin, Clayton, and then Dimitri. I wonder if there's something to like this perpetual act. The problem is the moment you start talking about presupposition less, It seems completely impossible and nihilistic. But there is something like, so I'm now thinking about, instead of the language participation, what if the opposite of calculation is improvisation? So we talk a lot about the cipher and art and different things. Are there presuppositions in improvisation? Kind of, not really. It's more like a skill or an art. And maybe it's the difference here between optimization and artfulness. Like the problem is optimization, but is artfulness. That seems different from calculation, right? And it seems to be what philosophy that is against presuppositions is in the business of, is making sure you don't ever stop employing the artfulness or the improvisation. And the freedom is found in the action of that perpetuation. But it's impossible to think, I guess, in a way, if we only think of presuppositionless as finding a state, like something to stand on. But what if it's more like a barrier that's keeping you from walking, and that gets to freeing speech, like we talked about? Well, that all goes with the orbit, like Jockin was sharing on Shipping the Lack. Now we're orbiting, right? Now, the presupposition, funny enough, in an orbiting metaphor, the presupposition could stop you from orbiting, right? And that's when then you might be at, that might be when you're at as Jockin was saying in the symposium, and then I'll give it to him, is that might be when you're at particular risk of treating lack maybe as an image that is dangerous, as opposed to an invitation to keep you orbiting. And in that orbit make you ever toward the partial as beautiful, the Beatrice and the Dante, right? And so then philosophy in the act of keeping speech freeing speech, is the act of then keeping desire moving, eros, Lacan, speech all go together, which then is to keep you moving in the orbit toward the other person that develops the subjectivity, and that then becomes kind of a framework to think about what exactly needs to be scaled, or what exactly scaling in, all while keeping in mind scaling is by definition antithetical to all of this, and it seems absurd to even suggest it. But we like absurd things here. And then also too, what's interesting is philosophy as such is always then keeping you towards situation, not merely point. And maybe that's the other difference, is that optimization typically is toward a point, toward a certain outcome, where this is what I put it, in artfulness and improvisation, it's like a range of possibilities. It's not anything. There's a range by the binding of the art, or maybe the humanity as a generality giving certain potentials, as Jockin was saying. So it's not like chaos, but it's also not a point. So it has a different quality than the optimization of you will make 100K or you will get all the good. Like that's a point versus encountering a range. And then a range sounds like orbit in that metaphoric structure. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin here. Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you. I'm glad I'm your #1 fan, grabbing the pre-order and listening to the video at the same time when it was a day early. Whoopsie daisy. That's fun. I think something I'm grabbing onto on the real pragmatic point of this is, and Daniel brought it up because I jumped in 15 minutes late. I apologize, but the coordination problem, like we have to, and Daniel brought it a couple of times. There's a huge issue here of. There's a big difference between a self-selecting group that pre-selects to basically be, shall we say, kind of not in that mode of optimization, shall we say. We're pre-selected we're in this group, we're choosing to use our time to do this instead of other things. This is not exactly how most people coordinate their lives. And in fact, quite frankly, most people, our lives are coordinated by external forces. It's true. How many of them can proactively set their lives? Like, I guess even like to critique the people who are the radical optimizers, like the cold shower people. You know what? I gotta be honest with you. Like, there are in a capture, absolutely in a kind of lacking capture, 100%. I don't disagree with that, but that's actually an improvement because at least it's a coordination of some self-action as opposed to external causation moving them. And I think generally, like, that's definitely been the argument. I mean, it's fine. I'm reading a lot of literature recently on propaganda. I mean, the model of propaganda is to presume that people can't make their own decisions, and they need to be externally coordinated to make the right decision for their own sake, either for their own sake or for the sake of the society, the larger entity. Manufacturing consent, for example, would be one point of this. So when you have a democracy with the presupposition that every person, every free individual has a right to work in the marketplace of ideas and come to a agreement of how to move forward, to go to war, not go to war, to do certain things, do not do certain things. Propaganda is on the presumption that no, they can't make a decision on their own, nor should they. But we have to do a pretense. So this whole I think the problem of what we've seen in the study of the 20th century is the kind of development of alignment ideas that say we are these liberal democracies where individuals have this freedom of choice and ideas and all this other stuff. No, all it does is just turn the battleground into a subterfuge. It's subterfuge, it's hidden, it's moving to the hidden spaces and coordinated through acts of coordination, propaganda, right? Basically, what news outlets you choose to listen to, and I think ironically through the mechanism of capitalism, right? Through free market, people get to choose which CNN or whatever their media input, right? What channel, what social media they get to subscribe to. These are all just this is all just mechanisms of coordination. That's all they are. And it's just feeding you self-images, new images, new information in a certain editorial context that leads to a certain conclusion. This is what we're discussing here about how would you not to address that? What the it's such not how things operate. And by the way, personally, I don't know, anyone who's been on this call a couple weeks has known I've been on Twitter debates with this one polemic discussion. I'm seeing it directly play out, how the operation of a polemic discussion where it's all agitation of emotion, right? Images who are pre-selecting, and it becomes basically a battleground of which frame is going to outrun the other. This is absolutely not how we're talking. This is so opposite from what we're discussing in this group right now, which is an issue of scale. And that's kind of the question. It's what do we take? What do we do with this? I think that's I'm kind of putting this on the table for everybody because I'm standing here going, is this supposed to be this way? Is this the best possible world? Is this the best possible world? And any kind of question to say it should be otherwise, just naive in the sense of just not realizing human nature and how, especially on an argument, if we can say that basically, oh no, we've given people freedom, but they become slaves by their desire. Their desires have enslaved them. And they've chosen the path they chose to go down. Whatever choice that they've decided to go down by what they choose to coordinate around, what they choose to orient themselves around, basically. I don't know, but I'm kind of I feel that's a little bit in the background of what there's a presupposition of kind of because I kind of feel the projects of everyone doing any intellectual thought is that we have to address something. Right? Why are we thinking? We're thinking because there's something to be addressed, right? And I'm just kind of sitting here going, well, there's a difference between, I guess, the question of self-help, right? In the sense of are we doing this are we in this project together to help improve ourselves or improve our souls? Or are we doing this for some other sake? To change other people? I don't know. I wonder with that. That's just a tangent note, just what I picked up, and I would love everyone just to meditate with me on. Because I feel that's important. Because then at least because I'm just saying it feels if we don't want to address that point, it's almost at least the question of what's the purpose of politics in the first place? Because in the Aristotelian Platonic mode, the law was absolutely designed to shape people. It was supposed to be done this way. No contest, and there was a moral order. There was a moral order that was oriented in that society, and quite frankly, people that did not assign to that society, they were exiled. And I talked to Javier privately about this. This look of and we still have threads of this logic, the language of toxicity. Oh, he was toxic, right? No, that language of pollution was in the classic Greek model. There was social pollution, and we have to release. We have to get this poison out. This person who's a cause of disruption has to be killed or removed, one or the other. We've just instead of a social structure having this pollution, we've individuated to radical individuals where our relationship to individuals now can be toxic or not. But I'll close with that.
Oh no, that was delightful. And Dimitri, you are more valuable than a $3,000, dollar vase. So don't you worry about that. I'll pass it to Clayton, Dimitri, and Javier. I think it's all extremely excellent. The coordination problem cannot be overstated. There's definitely the question that if we're talking about lack pragmatism, negative pragmatism, is this a private religion, a private way of life? Because here's the funny thing: in the name of avoiding optimization, you might just be optimizing your own personal affairs or finding a way of thinking. So there's a way in which negative pragmatism, if we use that language to be really negative, has to face something that seems to destroy it, which would be the coordination problem or scaling, because that's negative, baby. Otherwise, I think basically what occurs is a lot of people now dealing with the problems of scales basically comes up with private religions, intentional communities, customized philosophies by which to get a little bit of a niche to find coordination, but that means the world is delusion then, in the sense of pluralization, ever pluralizing, and you can understand why that emerges, because that seems to be the only way to deal with things. But of course, the response to that becomes Duginism, it can become isolationism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think definitely the coordination problem, the key is you cannot throw off any mechanisms of coordination. The other issues become, is it the case that capitalism tends toward a great stagnation, which means that it tends to go under and lead to black swan events? Do you have a situation of geopolitical tensions will continue to grow, leading to war and different things like that, meaning crisis, et cetera, so forth? Because if so, it would seem as if you need to scale or spread something. But then, of course, if you take the coordination problem seriously, it seems impossible to spread or scale anything. So the first thing we have to ask, to your question, Mr. Jockin, because I think you're spot on, is the question, is something like negative pragmatism scalable? Are we talking about something scalable, or are we talking about an individual customization that would help you deal with your own life? I think that's that's a very important question. People have customized Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and different religions all their life. People have customized nihilism, being told me everyone has found various customizations of different religions to find way to operate. So I think that's important. To me, there's a funny thing. Because I love how you're using the word address, because this is the entire address. So thank you, sir. And yes, you are a saint to buy that first book. And the coordination problem is straight out the gate. And it's going to have a lot to do with the medium of the classroom itself and law. People have focused way too much on political government structures and content of classrooms, not the incubator. This is why, to me, thinking of lack and situation becomes big, and medium, and the ability to train people in the ability to deal with surprise that has to have some sort of orbiting negentropic function. So these things I think are really good that you're bringing out. Basically, if it cannot scale, then it must have a presupposition. Like, right? Like, otherwise it would be non-contingent. Like there's a funny thing, which if whatever you're talking about has no scalability possibility, doesn't that automatically mean that there's a presupposition that can be denied by other people? The very ability to have it not be totalitarian is actually found in the test of scalability, and yet we tend to associate what is scalable as that which is totalitarian, right? And this is where I think people in the West or the Washington consensus were like, no, man, capitalism is human nature. Free markets are human nature. That's just what people do. So we can spread this around the world and everyone will be for it because it's actually part of human nature. No, culture matters, and it's deeper, as Belonging again talks about, right? But notice what's so critical is that sort of legitimization was based on a certain notion that it's actually presuppositionless because it's human hit. Now, of course, that's a presupposition, but it's based on a notion of a kind of theory of human beings. So we're not violating anyone, because they're actually secretly all going to follow the Washington consensus once they are free to follow the Washington consensus. And our political system in America continues to follow this theory of culture that is very, very consequential. But at the same time, on the Francis Fukuyama hegemony, political realists, all of them are going to come around and be like, buddy, are you saying nothing's scalable? Because the moment that we're going back to the religious wars, aren't we? Before Europe, that's an anti-enlightenment project. The world's going to splinter. And then who knows what the heck's going to happen? Are you really going to give up on that project? Yeah, and that's why Belonging again has to be about the question of global pluralism that is not a retreat or different things. So I really appreciate everything you were saying, but let me pass it to Clayton, Javier, and Mr. Winn. Clayton, it is good to see you, sir.
Yeah, glad to be here. Wow. I'm getting this image, unfortunately. I'm getting this image of, it seems like we're all in our little bubbles of experience, but the bubbles are they're only transparent to us, the inhabitants of the bubbles, and we can see what the reality is within the bubble. But unfortunately, on the outside of that experience bubble, there's a certain opacity level, and depending on the nature of the relationship with other people's reality bubbles, some of them are transparent to a certain degree, and some are just opaque. But these bubbles have to coexist in the same space, and sometimes they crash into each other. Sometimes we pop reality bubbles that we don't need to be popping, and then of course conflict ensues. But what I get from that is the idea of negative pragmatism is sort of like a map that shows you the spaces, that the reality bubble can float to or travel to, while avoiding other bubbles that you don't need to crash into. So riffing off the releasement idea, it seems to me it's like the releasement is some kind of allowance of other reality bubbles to exist, if I was to use that language. And sorry, while you are speaking, Jockin, I drew up that picture. I don't know if you guys can see it. So it's all bubbles. And within one of the bubbles, you have that guy, there's a person in each one of them, and they have like some VR thing going on, right? But everyone has a VR thing going on. The headsets from Apple? Yes, like everybody's walking around with those, and sometimes we're bumping into each other and we're like, hey, get out of my space. I thought I was in the middle of the desert all by myself. I thought I was in an ocean. It's like, no, you're on the street and there's poles and there's walls, there's cars. Those things are still real. And so yeah, it's for me, it seems like a very complex problem. Like it's much, the complexity is immense. And I think all these ideas, all these philosophies are really just trying to help with the navigation of that mess. Is when we get to a stable place where the mess ends and the chaos dissipates? I don't think so, because essentially that's life. Like chaos is life, right? If we get to that place where the chaos dissipates, then we're probably dead. Like everything is dead. We're like, yeah, there's no more life. Do we want normal life? Probably not. Is the chaos, the conflict within the chaos, is it something we can escape completely? I'm not sure. I don't know. I'll leave it there.
No, it's outstanding, and I should note, for me, I really like also the idea of wearing a VR headset and running into someone and saying, "You're in my space." That sounds like that is the metaphor for geopolitics throughout human history. Hey, you were in my space because I had my VR headset and saw the world in a certain way. That's hilarious. I really like that. It's very interesting because to the spread scale problem of different things. I had a conversation with Philip where we talked about a number of different things. Is that it does. So Habermas talks about commutative rationality, where basically the problem is democracy became a voting project instead of a conversational structure, and as a result failed because democracy is primarily speech in conversation. And also following Jonathan Rout and all these different things, it seemed like speak is the way that you equate knowledge. And speech is very interesting because speech in of itself is not presuppositional, it's an act, even if you talk about presupposition. So you make the basis the relation. And critically, speech seems to be not merely, I think it's relatia, which is a relation that's not in the phenomenological frame, but it's a relation that is in the phenomenological frame, right? Speaking and also communicating, let's just say communicating, well, I'll say speaking, but communication could be eyes, sign language you take, so that could be it. So it's not just verbal. But Speaking is interesting because it seems to be relation that is meaningful to the subjects involved. And that seems to be what you need to do if you're talking about global pluralism, not killing one another, right? You need meaningful relations. But here's the problem. The moment you start speaking, you can misunderstand one another, you can get angry, and you can conflict with one another. Chetan is such a saint being up at 5 a minute. So conversation becomes a really big deal and seems to work on desire. And also, as the other thing that's very interesting, is if you go through like geopolitics, one of the number one things they say is important, like diplomacy, following all like Hunter and all these different people, is when nations stop talking to one another. When they stop talking to one another, you get a nightmare. Like that's when all the crap happens, right? Likewise, creativity tends to occur from like conversations where ideas pop up, cipher they never had before, and innovation seems to go with wealth, right? Also following rhetoric and Dietrich McCloskey, the ability, like the very change in speech tends to create wealth in different things. And also speech seems to be tied to friendship and different things. So I think for me, something about the speech act is part of the scalability issue, and then teach people in those capacities. Because then what you're scaling is a certain activity that is an openness to the other, that is not shutting them down, but has them related in a meaningful way. So freeing speech has a lot to do with the political project or the political economy that that belonging again has to get into, because all of these different areas, when you go down the scale, really shows how much the capacity of human beings to speak to one another, because that's what opens it. Because the other thing, the speech act is inherently a flirting with surprise, because you don't know what the other is going to say. And and it's also vulnerable because you're vulnerable to the surprise, right? And we're saying more and more that something about negative pragmatism has a lot to do with surprise. And so for me, negative pragmatism, which is tied to this question of scalability, has something to do a lot with speaking. It has a lot to do with communication. And then the whole world around you that's stable is what makes possible that surprise. Because if it was chaos, you couldn't have surprise. This is the funny thing. I was talking with Matthew Allison about this. Natural laws make it possible for there to be surprise. And we tend to say that it's the natural law that's most real. But what if actually the surprise is most real that the natural law makes possible, right? So the consistency is what makes the consistency is not primary. The consistency is just necessary for the surprise. Ergo beauty, ergo partial object. And here's the issue. The scalability problem has to be solved, dare I say, or addressed with some sort of spreading of a constancy that focuses the surprise, not the constancy. Because the focus on the constancy is what makes the totalitarianism or destroys the coordination problem, right? What you have to focus on is a consistency of some sort of ground that makes people open to the surprise, but then they are habituated to be able to handle it, which then gets into the primacy of the classroom and then a bunch of different things. But all of these, here's the key, all of these are environmental more than they are content. Content almost has to give you totalitarianism. It almost has to, because if I'm saying everyone needs to do or learn X, well, this is power then. But if I instead say, no, people don't need to change, what they need is to have more opportunities for being in certain environments to where they can develop themselves according to the potential actuality that they already entail, if that space allows the entertaining of the virtual, the imaginative, and the exploring. So this gets into things like freeing speech. And then the philosopher is in the business of keeping a presupposition from arising that could lead to totalitarianism. Like this is the thing, a presupposition becomes a basis that can then lead to totality destroying diversity, right? So philosophy, as in a kind of negative pragmatism, is always saying, no, presupposition, presupposition, presupposition. But then if they're doing it to everyone in their difference that is unfolding according to their deep difference is unified in the perpetual act of that motion, right? Because they can't stop. But they also are not stopping in their unique unfolding according to how they think and what they are, right? So the problem is, I think, partly is we've dealt with global pluralism by trying to unify states as opposed to establishing meaningful relations on different trajectories. And what's shared is the action. Because if you're trying to share states, well, then there has to be a presupposition that leads to totality. Everyone's actually neoliberal and they just don't know it. Everyone is actually Western, they just don't know it. We just got to free them from the corrupt government. Everyone actually would be a capitalist if they just knew better, and so on and so forth. Now, that's not to say capitalism doesn't uniquely deal with the coordination problem, Dietrich, Hayek and all that different things. But once we start thinking about well, what is the basis of global unity or global pluralism that leads to a harmony versus a totality is some sort of shared action, then the philosopher might have something to do with being in the business of keeping people in that state of movement, in that orbit, so they actually can work together as opposed to having solid states that conflict with one another. So something like freeing speech then becomes very important. And then, of course, I think you can make the case geopolitically how much of a big deal that has when you look through the history of different diplomats between different nations. Like, you look at some of them, like, they'll say, like, one of the keys is when you go and talk to, say, the Chinese or different nations, you don't go in with a presupposition. The moment you go in with a presupposition, it's just a fight, where real diplomacy requires a suspending of presuppositions to actually be open to the other. Otherwise, you end up in conflict war. And I think similar things happen in business. The moment you have a presupposition of what is the best product, you're closed off to innovation. Therefore, you stagnate. And then if the system becomes reifying or preserving into law presuppositions or capital, then you can't have creative destruction. And so you have these various systems. And maybe the opposite of optimization is creative destruction in another sense, improvisation or this living creative destruction. But let me pass it to Javier, Mr. Winn, and then Chetan. Javier Rivera.
All right, I'll briefly answer the Julie Resch question. What I like about Julie Resch is that she's very uninterested in imposing the negative. She only leaves it on the table for another interesting way of having relations. You could say I'm with Thomas in the sense that I would say I would add this extra element to releasement, which would be, what are all the interesting ways we can talk about releasement? What are all the interesting sentences we can talk about releasement? To me, this is the negative pragmatism as such. Because we come into this weird imposition where, this is like the whole Buddhist contradiction thing. You say, yes, practice letting go. And then the person goes, okay, yeah, I'm letting go. This is where they catch themselves, ironically. They go, yeah, I'm letting go. Yeah, I'm getting enlightenment. But then they realize that they can't let go. This is what I enjoy. They realize they can't let go. And then the Buddhist says, yeah, let go of that. Let go of the fact that you can't let go. Let go of the fact that you can't deal with lack. To me, that is the double movement of negative pragmatism. It would be like, yes, do something with your lack. And then they go, I realize I can't do anything with my lack. And it's like, yeah, let go of that. Let go of that. Okay, but to me, I want to challenge this, even to myself, is what are the different relations we can have to this releasement? I agree with releasement and letting go, but what are the different relations we can have? Is it possible? Or is it only ever contingent upon the point of failure that we discover the multiplicity of the relations that we can have to releasement? And this is the thing that I'm trying to explore. Is it only ever that? Let me see what else. Oh, and this topic of power, Daniel, that you brought up. I actually like Foucault on this issue, because it's not about it is about preventing the totalitarianism thing, but it's about the power relation itself. Meaning, for Foucault, it has to be reversible. Meaning that the lack itself must be able to move. If it cannot move, then that's immobile. That's domination. I guess you can say that's my problem with the idea. I mean, it's not even. I'm not trying to moralize here. So maximizing lack, minimizing lack, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem that happens is when we put up barriers to prevent any other movement, when no other movement is possible for reversal, right? To me, this is what Foucault calls the practice of freedom. And I think this is what fundamentally negative pragmatism is the practice of freedom, but at the point of failure, when you cannot, and then you have to let go of that. When you realize that you are a subject of lack, which can only be realized at the point of failure. But then I wonder if I would like to play on Foucault in terms of putting it as an imposition. Embrace your lack and then realize that you can't do it. I actually wonder if I could do that paradoxical move or that contradictory move of making it a normative only to realize that it's only a descriptive. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, I think it's brilliant to bring in Foucault. I mean, because he's so fascinating. The early Foucault and seeing norms and power as being oppressive. As he gets later, he's like, oh, crap, if you don't have any norms, people go nuts. So we have to have norms, but so you have to have norms to let go. But then if you have norms and they get solidified, they could become totalitarian. So you have to play with risk. This is Philip Reef as well. Like without givens, people go nuts. But then if there's just givens, it's totalitarian, right? So you have to have, belonging again, the address will talk about gifts, this kind of movement and this kind of structure of gifts. I think also, like I've talked about, as you know, phenomenology of the artist. For me, I think a lot, and I think it aligns with negative pragmatism, almost like beauty pragmatism or aesthetic pragmatism, and I will call it conditionalism, which is what are the practices you need to engage with to have more beauty in your life, in the way Thomas Jockin talks about, to actually have that experience of a part, like partial object pragmatism in a way, right? Like this thing of what are the practices or definitive pragmatism, not that I'm, throwing out more terms because, well, actually, what good is a philosopher if they don't come up with at least 80 new words in their lifetime? I mean, come on now. So there's a certain sort of like partial object pragmatism or beauty pragmatism, which is the question of what conditions do you need to meet, or definitive pragmatism. What do you need to do to approach the definitive object versus just a definition, to approach Michelle versus woman, to approach a definition of reality versus the actual thing that unveils its partiality that then pulls you in, right? Because it would seem like that's the kind of pragmatism that's very much missing. We have pragmatism or practices you need to engage with. Like I think about the arts a lot, like how to be more creative. These kind of like retreats and things you go on. Like for me, when I think about what you're saying about the dangers of optimization, I think about that. And there seems to be a difference, even though there can be some benefits from these retreats to become a better artist, that are not the same as falling in love with beauty. Like that seems to be different. So what is the pragmatism that makes someone fall in love with beauty? Because that's the secret sauce. And basically when Belonging Again talks about spreading childhood or absolute knowers or spreading the conditions needed for the average person to fall in love with beauty, that to me is getting at this kind of pragmatism. Like what are the conditions, ergo environment, that needs to be met so that people then organically on their own engage in the practices to fall in love with beauty? Because if you can get people to fall in love with beauty, which sounds totalitarian unless you know what beauty is. Beauty cannot be fully captured, right? Now, like, if I define for you what beauty is or what it means you should do, I start getting into trouble. That's where you need the annihilation. But beauty, if we're talking about a society that increases the probability of the average falling in love with beauty, I don't think we're talking about totalitarianism anymore. You're talking about a garden, right? Because here's the trick. What Foucault understood, and then I'll give it to Winn, Jockin, and Chiton, Foucault, as he got older, understood that you had to have some socialization. You had to have some community or people go nuts. And he's like, so that means there has to be some power. But then he's like, crap, if there's some power, there's always the risk of too much power. What do we do? That's the problem we're still dealing with, right? If you have too much givens, it's bad. Too much freedom, it's bad. What do? What is the principle that you quote unquote optimize to in this way that's free from optimization? What do you let go to allow this letting go that also lets go and all of these fun meta moves? It seems to be beauty. It seems to be what the metric of success has something to do with falling in love with beauty, which to me, the metric of that existing on the individual level is something like intrinsic motivation. It is something like life. It is like drive versus mere desire of an object. It becomes a way of life. And these tend to be the things that you want to spread that would be evidence not of a totalitarianism, but a successful cultivation. Because when you're intrinsically motivated people, you're leaving them free in that intrinsic motivation. You have given them enough of a nudge, to use that sustained term that Mr. Frege is correct, Mr. Frege is correct, can be correct that some of that nudge thinking can be a soft totalitarianism. He's exactly right. But what Foucault understood at the end of his life is you have to have some kind of soft totalitarianism. You have to have some sort of ability to cultivate people, or they become psychotic in various bad ways, or they can't relate to one another because it's too difficult. So we're basically finding, like cooking in a kitchen, which sounds like social engineering, so we're already in trouble to even be talking about that, but it sounds like you're looking for some sort of right fittingness to these things. And that's where the question of if lack is the central metaphysics that you're orbiting, that's important because that's going to determine what you're fitting to on your own individual life. And to me, that lack is precisely the experience of a partial object that is a pulling of beauty. So you're increasing the probability of the possibility of people to experience beauty, which I think has something to do with freeing speech, because the more that you can free, this is the funny thing. I believe that the more you free people from presupposition, the more they are likely to fall in love with beauty. That's kind of the funny thing, you would think. But it's also the very thing that risks nihilism in the bad say. The very thing that seems to increase the probability of people falling in love with beauty is simultaneously the thing that is most at risk of making them fall into bad nihilism as well, right? And so that's the weird thing, because I think a lot of people who say have done the journey and falling in love with beauty, they must, my take is that they, for some reason, said, let me go do that thing. Let me go open up to that thing, or open up to this book, or open to something. They had this presuppositionless moment or choice or something that allowed that development with a relation of beauty. Maybe it's because they played Final Fantasy VI and then said, let me go into the forest and see what comes out of walking around, right? So, you know, I went into the forest to be surprised by the imagination and the virtual that was possible because of the conditioning of the actuality of Final Fantasy VI that I cared about, because of the unfolding potential that then fueled the virtuality of walking around in the woods, right? And then then Final Fantasy leads to photography, that leads to writing, and all of these things have some sort of openness to, maybe I will take pictures, maybe I will write about the signs of tribulation, maybe I will see what the forest is like at night. There's some sort of maybe I will that seems to be a sort of not assuming you already have everything you need, or you already know that, or there's nothing there. Like, the only reason you would explore the mystery or go down the path is because you're like, there's something there. Maybe there's something there. Maybe, that's all. There were plenty of places I walked to where there was nothing. But the maybe seemed to be the prerequisite for the possibility of falling in love and being cultivated in an intrinsic motivation. And the question is scaling that. And that seems to be, the more you can remove presuppositions, it seems to me, and the more you can get people also accustomed to a life of annihilating those presuppositions, the higher the probability that they fall in love with beauty or have some sort of relation to beauty, because the experience of beauty is an experience of something that in a way is not presuppositional. Any presupposition or assumption you arrive at, it then moves you out of, and it moves you out of. So there's something about that movement of the subject that is against presupposition, but not in a naive, kind of anarchistic way. You're always like stages in a Dante way, movement, right? And that seems to be what Foucault is pointing to at the end. A movement of society, of a moving norm that seems to be like beauty, the movement of beauty. So I think Foucault and a lot of the sociologists are speaking about, in order to have a political or sociological or economic project that is actually freedom, it would have some sort of isomorphic structure to the movement of beauty. And that, I think, is very important. And you have a wonderful comment here that I would like to reply to, but I will give it to Mr. Winn and Mr. Jockin maybe in a moment, and then cheat time. So Mr. Winn, please.
It's no surprise. Like, basically, Hegel's work is to point you to beauty, in my opinion. Like, what he calls absolute spirit is nothing other than the constant exhibition of beauty, which means the negativity towards that mysterious space, which is rational or logical insofar as you're exposed to the notion of beauty. And it's a notion which doesn't just subsist there in itself as something static. It's that which dissolves and moves into actuality, but comes back again, like it remains left over. So my original point, I wanted to kind of bring in Zizek a bit, because I'm working on him at the moment and just tying him together with this idea of releasement. But I think it's to go to what Javier said, like about the Buddha, the Buddhist motive towards enlightenment, you know, like letting go as enlightenment. And I think Zen Buddhism is quite interesting, because I would say most interpretations that I've encountered of Zen Buddhism concerning letting go have remained towards this idea of letting go, you know, like, okay, I have a desire towards objects that's causing me suffering. The only way to reach my Buddha state is to achieve this kind of non-willing, like this way of being, which can be like without things and not need things, and of course encounter things like food and water and stuff, but it's the awareness of not needing in that sense. But basically, there's Alan Watts, who was a very influential person in my life when I was very young. He has a reading of Christianity, Zen Buddhism, and Taoism. And he says what Taoism shows us, even within the origins of Zen Buddhism as well, is that really it's about letting go to the degree that you fail. So Javier, your what you said about like the person going to the Buddha and saying like, okay, I've been trying for 4 days to get rid of my ego. And the master says, keep trying, keep trying, keep trying, keep trying, keep trying, keep trying. And then the person comes back and say, I give up, like I can't get rid of it. And then he goes, okay, good. Like you've done it, in the sense you realized that what you were trying to get rid of or let go of was itself a product of your own experience in that sense. And the person went, yep, I've reached enlightenment. And then he said, no, try again. Because he thought that he himself as subject had attained enlightenment, and so then he fell back into the trap, which was like, I need to achieve enlightenment. Well, there's an example of this television show when I was young in Britain, where there was a guy who was like, these aliens came down to him and they said, okay, we're going to exterminate you unless you become cool. And the guy was like, okay, I have to become cool. So he like speaks to people like, oh, how can I be cool? And they're like, what you need to do is like fulfill this like this list of things to do and stuff. And he fulfills it and he achieves coolness. But as soon as he recognizes this, he says, oh, now I'm cool. He becomes uncool because he's registered himself as cool. So it was too like egotistical. And then he dies because the aliens kill him to say, yeah, you attained it, but then you thought you attained it and then you're screwed. But basically, like, this is what Heidegger tackles a lot in like country path conversations. So if there's a text I would point you to, is to read this, because the scientist is also like this, is skeptical about willing. Like, how can you not will? Like, I'm a scientist and I will truth. I will to understand what thinking is, you know? Like, what is knowledge if it's not willing? Like, we are all here now willing something. Like, we're willing to share, or we're willing to listen. Like, and that's like the modern way of understanding the human experience is like, I am willing things. I desire things. I'm hungry. I'm tired. But I think the idea of Heidegger is more towards after this period, like letting be. What this means is to recognize what being is, like what life, unless we can use life or being is the term because it is different, but the way to understand is like in a common, like a way of understanding from common sense is like, life itself is that which gives you the experience of what you're experiencing already. Like, you are alive, you haven't achieved anything. To be alive, you are alive. And this is what Alan Watts would say. So he gives the example of breathing, like in the Zen Buddhist tradition. To attain the state of meditation, it's the attempt to say, okay, try and breathe. And you make a very conscious effort to try and breathe. And when you try and breathe, you recognize that you get caught up on your breath. But then what you recognize at the same time is that you are unconsciously of yourself breathing anyway, despite your inability to achieve it. And it's that recognition that life itself is that which gives you breath. That moment is of letting be, because you realize that, oh, I didn't even need to try and achieve this, or I didn't even need to let go of my stupid idea about breathing, because I'm already breathing. Heidegger's point concerning letting be is that you are let be of yourself anyway, because being is that which is giving you over to experience. And I think this then also applies, and this was my original point with Zizek actually, it applies to society. Like, this is the question. So there's a quote from Zizek in Surplus Enjoyment, where he says, like, at the end of everything of his whole philosophy, what he calls subjective destitution in this book, and it's a very recent book, makes a comment saying, we shift away from, in this state of subjective destitution, which is immediately political, calls it the object as comrade. We become comrades in our own destitution. He says that we shift away from trying to master objects and toward learning to respect them in their elusiveness. And so this is the idea, like, how is it that objects approach us in communities, like philosophical communities, in capitalism? Heidegger's point is that actually letting things be is the highest form of care. And this is why Zizek's very different from Heidegger, and Vattimo, who I'm concerned with, is very different from Heidegger. I think they have a very wrong reading of Heidegger, because what Heidegger's pointing you towards is not pragmatism in that sense. It's not saying like, let's reuse the history of interpretations to affirm freedom. What he's saying is freedom is already the way to be, and it gives you ideas of itself, you know? Like, it is that space of creativity that you don't need to achieve because it comes to you automatically of itself, you know? And it's if we hang out in that space of rest in communities like this, and I trust that I can be given over to some ideas, then things start to move, you know? But then this is why Vattimo and Zizek are good, and they weren't fascist like Heidegger was, because they say, well, actually, we do live in capitalism, and it's giving me particular subject-object related ideas, you know? So we can twist these, we can reuse these, actually, to affirm a way of life. And this is my comment in the chat, like, perhaps the presupposition of peace or freedom are those presuppositions that become pragmatically possible because they do nothing other than release those ideas that attempted to dominate the playing field. Like, and this is what Heidegger does get to. So I made a note saying Heidegger means to be given over to thinking. Like, he thinks there is a way of thinking called thinking. At the end of philosophy, there's thinking. Released quality of thinking, which does not need to experience like weak reinterpretations of the past, but a thinking which can ground the communal dimension upon those thoughts which have their essence in truth. So Heidegger's concerned with truth. Example, peace. It's like poetry and peace. Freedom, dwelling. And this is what comes back to our conversation I was in before on the net, like building, technique, you know? He affirms technique in the communal space because he says we can build to dwell, you know? Like we can build pragmatically, dwell spiritually, philosophically. And then I said, and most important, he has this idea of thinking, which is gathering. Like, if I want to relate to you in an authentic way, it's to let you be. And what happens is things are gathered to my mind. So the root word of thinking in like the old Germanic way of language is to gather. Is to bring things close to you in thinking, you know? And that quality which lets things be brought to mind is what he wants to experience. And that's why and it's not an excuse for him at all, because I'm anti-fascist completely. In the beginning years of his in his political ideas concerning fascism, on the Eastern Front he had like what he saw as an industrial communism, and in the West he had like a mechanized capitalism. He thought that what we had to return to was a sense of like letting things be around us, in that sense, like the nearest things, what Nietzsche would say. Of course he was wrong, because that then became, this is the question, like it became like dogmatic again, in the sense it was no longer belonging again, but dogmatic again. And why? Because maybe he presupposed certain things within that space, you know? And this is maybe why like a negative pragmatics is possible and important, because we have to return to that mystery, you know, or lack, or at least the beginning moment of lack, to then destitute things and then to see what happens, you know. And then perhaps, like Zizek says, we can shift away from trying to master objects and towards learning to respect them in their elusiveness, like the planet, or even like, I don't know what Dimitri was really talking about, but like philosophical communities, you know. Like if you're a part of that community, it's like letting people be. And for example, if you let someone be and they become repeatedly like stupid or violent, then you can make a very graceful decision and say, look, this community is very open and friendly, but you're being, I don't know, a dick, you know, at that point, you know. And then you can have like an ethics. It's like, that is what an ethics means of a community as well. It's like, okay, freedom. So if you have like a new communist party in Britain, it's like, okay, welcome everybody. And then if you get a fascist that comes in and keeps turning up every Thursday and keeps repeating these ideas, at some point you can say like, all right, we kind of love you in a way, but please leave, because you're not doing anything for this community, because you're not letting people be, because you're having ideas which are violent, you know. I think this is a very nice way to approach community. And like, that is what I meant. Like a lot of my future research, I hope, does go down that route, because it is a kind of ethics. And when I told my main, the supervisor, I'm interested in ethics, he was like, what? Because he's a nihilist. So because he thinks that nihilism means that's it, just there's no meaning, we have to kind of deal with it. And like, as soon as you say ethics in that space, it's like, what? But I don't think he's read Heidegger properly. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Winn. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when he said, no, thanks to the nihilist. He's like, oh, one of the cool kids, huh? That's hilarious. There's a few things. I think I'll give it to Jockin and Cheetah. You know, another way to think about it, I think basically we have to rethink the social contract. Most of the social contract is the notion of rights, and people should have housing, food, income, so on and so on, right? What we are basically suggesting here is, because there is something ontological about lack, is that a political project that is based on objects, food, shelter, clothing, is not actually fulfilling the ultimate, dare I say, human need, which has something more to do with dwelling, right? That actually become like dwelling in this deeper sense, right? And you see, the issue is if you have a society that optimizes or tries to construct to make sure that everyone has food, shelter, peace and stuff, you may just give them boredom, right? And basically what we've assumed is we've got, but if you take care of people's basic needs, then they will find dwelling. No. And in fact, here's the problem. What if you create a society that provides people's needs in a manner that takes away their capacity to dwell? Ooh, that would be a problem. And so you would have to reformat the social contract or the school system or the education or the economy to make sure that the means by which you are providing food, shelter, et cetera, so forth, does not unintentionally remove the capacities for dwelling. And that seems to be the challenge of first world. And it's a reasonable mistake, because who cares about philosophical discussion if you're starving or if there's like war, right? But the issue is, like, as you move, and I think we've talked about it before, as you move from third world to first world, your ethical system has to move from something like utilitarianism to value ethics, or the ability to make choices, or something like Nietzsche says, on the ability to choose the noble versus just simply good as the opposite of bad, right? And we don't seem to have a political or communal thinking that incubates dwelling, because the government is the business of the social contract and human rights and so on and so forth. And then the irony I would like to say is that if you make an economy that's optimizing, providing people with food, shelter, and et cetera, so forth, Clayton, I love you, is that if you do that, you actually ironically lead to stagnation in the very capital markets that then actually are not even able to keep the social contract. That's the big irony I want to argue through economics, is that if you have an economy that's based on providing necessities, then actually it incubates a lack of the wealth creation needed to even do that. So the social contract that's not including dwelling in this way, which has something to do with falling in love with beauty, because like right now, like there's something like, if the human being, I just think about, like, in the afternoon, I just want to be home on the porch because it's beautiful, or I want to be around the kids, right? Like, you want to dwell, right? Like, that seems to be freedom. This freedom before beautiful, the dwelling, the freedom in, right? And that does not seem to be something Michelle and I talk about it all the time. School never mentioned that. Jobs never mentioned that. The media doesn't mention that. You'll have things like enlightenment and so on and so forth. But the problem is, I think you were getting at it, Mr. Winn, we seem to have talked about minimalism and enlightenment from the wrong ontology. It's still from a kind of ontology of being, not lack, and not annihilation. So therefore, it doesn't lead to an orbiting structure that has something to do with the conditioning with beauty. And it doesn't have character or kind of value ethics in this way that's needed. Because if you say, well, just be a minimalist, well, then you might not read Aristotle. You say, okay, I'll own it. Well, you have less stuff, but you're not engaged in the phenomenological journey. You've not engaged in the work of intrinsic motivation. You're removing or throwing stuff away or letting go. Well, just let go. Why not detach from the desire for intrinsic motivation? Why not detach from trying to work yourself for the place of beauty, right? This is the problem. Then it goes too far, right? So you have to ask the question of what are you trying to be fitting for? And it seems to be dwelling, beauty. And the thing that the argument is that I am putting forth is that the probability of increasing dwelling as such increases as you create practices of removing presupposition, and you make a social order and community that removes presupposition. And the argument would be that the likelihood of community, like we don't do festivals anymore. I think about this all the time. Like there's no festivals. Yeah, because we're scared of the other, because we have presuppositions. And what if they think we raise our kids wrong and blah, 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 right? And so there's a fear of judgment and then technology and so on, right? All of these to me suggest that there is something about the presupposition that is contributing to the lack of openness to the festival, to the other, to the development with beauty, that then if you rethought the social contract as social dwelling or social conditioning for dwelling, you would think differently. And the questions, the government would become far more architectural. Humans become more architectural. We become more geometrical than algebraic. And then I'll say more. The other thing I was going to say is philosophy has made the mistake of thinking the event without the encounter. That's the big mistake. Like when we talk about the grace of the event or grace coming forth, the event breaking forth, speculative realism, et cetera, so forth. No, the event must be tied into the surprise of the encounter with the other. And that would require those subjects that can do that. So I think we're also suggesting with the surprise, the event that is found to the encounter, and the encounter is also tied to beauty. And also, as just a practical note, if it is true that living with annihilating or letting go presupposition increases beauty, that has a big impact on how you raise your kids or you educate your kids. And this would be also kind of a question of the point of all this. Like, I'm of the opinion that the less my children have a tendency to fall into presupposition, and I think I might have froze and I don't know. But okay, yep, no, I saw movement. Okay, I'm back.
Finally.
Advantage, the internet sucks. The only thing I was going to say, like, for me, if it's true that removing presupposition increases beauty, then I want to educate my children to have habits of working against presupposition. So there's a practical consequence, because that would increase their openness to the other and intrinsic motivation and different things, and myself. So, like, if that is true, then that would impact those different things. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin, and sorry about vanishing there. I love you.
It's all good. You know what's funny? I mean, this reminds me a little bit of the symposium on practical negativism, because the whole idea of measure of lack, I just had a light of insight about that. I don't know. I've heard of Wittgenstein's ruler, that analogy, and I actually went back and double checked what it actually meant. So, for example, if you have a ruler and you're using the measure table, but you're not confident of the ruler, the less confident you are on the ruler, the more the data from that measurement says more about the ruler than about the table. I bring that up because would we not say that actually an object like beauty has a definite excess lack, right, is absolutely this thing that would operate that way? But every time we use that object, that unit as a measure, we're getting more information about beauty than actually the thing being measured against. I just say that because, presuppositions, one way to look at it, they're mental models in the head, right? And Daniel, your point about surprise. Now, surprise is a really interesting thing, right? Because it's both a statistical object that can be measured and known quantitatively, but it's also qualitative. Just by very fact it causes arousal, let alone the emotion side. But Daniel, we've talked this before, like emotion as an object it's incredibly fascinating, because it's a kind of demonstration of the ontological status of lack. Because how can your mental model in your head, bro, be affected by surprise and be measured and known? It means that something external must have affected you, let alone the fact that it can have multiplicity of effects, so that multiple persons observing this phenomenon, their models get affected, but in a similar manner. So there's a consistency of effect too. So I just say that because this object of surprise, right, which we've discussed, like, why beauty, the way we're talking about it, right, this is this idea of this kind of awareness. The example used a lot is like apprehension, right, or nous. Better said, nous has completely been like, we've dismissed that. It's like, oh no, we don't count that in our understanding of the psyche, of the mind, how it operates in human souls. But that was a very important Greek and biblical understanding and Islamic understanding, the noetic light. That's a really important, because it is this idea, like, exactly, it's, you don't cause nous. Like, that's kind of the point. Like, there's a fascinating discussion about basically the active intellect, right? And if God is that active intellect, and we are basically agent intellects, and there's a kind of potential activation of our intellects, right? But that nous, that kind of awareness, that kind of shocking revelation, surprise is pointing to that. So there's just like interesting dynamics about it. But I'm bringing it up that I'm circling this around to say beauty, when we use a unit as a measure that thus used as a reference point, even if we're not confident in it, like a thing like we don't know what beauty actually is, like, it's because it cannot be captured, right? It doesn't have that kind of property being captured. Nevertheless, as an orientation of how to interact with reality, with our mental models, like, this is what I'm saying, like, this is not a presupposition. This is perfectly fine as an object of presupposition, because that it's not that the problem that there's a surprise that's an issue. Usually that is. Usually the problem is, like, usually in these accounts, either our model has to be updated to address the surprise, or their stolen reality has to be corrected to fit our model. What we're pointing out here in negative pragmatism, again, Javier, let me know, but I'm chewing on this, is to point out, like, no, that's actually that's the wrong question. Of either the model needs to be updated to be collapsed to the new datum to remove the surprise, or the external reality has to be mapped on to correspond to the model, right, in our heads. No, what we're pointing out here is that it's that awareness of a surprise that demonstrates the unit that's being used as a measurement, right? In this case, and that's the point, is that our selection of a unit, the measure, even if we're in this kind of this operational definite excess, and that's what the beautiful is, that's why we're using this argument here, is that point is that when we use that, we're getting information about that measure, right? Every time we use it as a reference point. So even if we cannot even define it, it's fine because of this. Now, there's some interesting challenges with that. I'm sure we can bring it up. But I'm kind of drawing out. And last note about this, I say this because there is a radical difference between, I think we talked about this before in education. When we're dealing with people, we have to use measures of a quantitative quality versus discernment. This is what I'm drawing out. The most mature kind of education is the kind where discernment is being used, because we're using objects that are qualitative, that have this kind of definite excess operation, that don't have such easy quantification of explicit attributes and properties that can be counted and whatnot. That's what we're kind of drawing out. And I think Wittgenstein's ruler is actually drawing out that point too, a little bit by this painting. I think there are some challenges to this, I would say, because I'm not satisfied with me talking out loud this drawing out of the unit, and why something like the beautiful is a different unit than the good or the true, for example. This gets a little complicated because you have to make an argument why that would be the case. And let alone kind of the problem too is what happens when we're using normative standards as the ruler. So this is the whole idea of status or social mores, for example. Like we have to make an argument of why there's something distinct here going on between these kind of nominal, and that's something actually I've seen the discussion about this, nominal lacks versus ontological lacks, right? I've seen that discussion in some literature where social constructs and virtual mappings, models that are cultural, social in nature, can generate a unit. And there you go. And then it just, like, what we have to make an argument why somehow good, trueness, and beauty has some kind of separation, has non-normative standards, or super normative in quality that seems to be independent. But I admit that's an obvious weakness we have to draw out. But I'll leave it with that.
No, it's all excellent points. And, for me, as you know, I'll sometimes talk about intersuppositional, which is the idea of the supposition that arises in the relation as opposed to something you bring in to the relation. I think it's also interesting because one of the funny, then I'll give it to Cheeto. What's interesting about a lot of presuppositions is the problem that they actually are post-suppositions in the sense that you still hold them afterwards. Nothing really changes. They're not temporally conditioned or different things, right? Like it seems like one of the things that the pure relativist, if you grant that language, tried to do is go in without any presuppositions at all. Well, then you can't communicate and it's chaos, right? So you have to go in with some working model, but this gets into the willing to let it go, right? There seems to be a difference between having a model that you don't hold too tightly, that you hold like this, the bird on the hand, versus with a grip, right? And also what's interesting with beauty to me, I like what you said on surprise, because it brings out how it's basically impossible to undergo a surprise that is not first qualitative and then quantitative, which seems unique because everything else seems like it could easily be quantitative then qualitative, right? But the surprise is really interesting in that the qualitative is first. And that seems to be, if we are in an age of that one philosopher who talks about the dominance of the quantitative over the qualitative, then the surprise might be restructuring according to the qualitative and then the quantitative afterwards, as opposed to getting a various tyranny of that. But yeah, there's something about beauty that's very intersuppositional in that this is beauty comes not from thinking ahead of time, this is beautiful, oh, there it is, but it strikes you. And there's also something with the measure, because it's almost like in beauty, you feel more measured by it than you measuring it. Like I'm measured by this thing, which one works against the argument of like, I'm the only mind. Beauty has always confirmed there's a world to me. Like it's there. Like there's a there. Oh, okay. And this is very important for me in political consideration, because one of the great arguments of making empiricism and science and facts central is because the argument is if you do not do that, if there's no objective basis, then everyone is stuck in their VR headset. Everyone's stuck in their own worldview, and you'll never have consensus, right? You'll never have the ability to run a country because everyone will go off, right? Well, that argument is actually kind of still sound. Like if there is not an agreed upon something external from people, what would be the basis of compromise that didn't just feel like a power move, right? Like how could democracy possibly work if there's not something external from people's world, right? So the scientists all had a good point. Here's the problem. Science has to be reductionistic in this way, even if science and facts still have a very important role. What's interesting to me is if beauty and the good and the true, and then of course all the details of that, actually is experienced by the subject as external to them, then beauty could have the function of the fact as that in science and empiricism that was supposed to deal with the issues of the religious wars, right? But then people would have to be conditioned for it. And maybe the surprise could as well. The surprise, the strike of beauty, and also the changing of time, like in a dialogos conversation, this experience of time speeding up, kairos leisure, all of these things seem to be experiences that suggest there is a world there. And that seems to be able to deal with these problems of the religious wars that facts and science were there to deal with, that still are very important because we need the science and the facts to figure out how to create the conditions and situations in which beauty and surprise and all of these things can be engaged in for the encounter of a world that is there. And so to me, all this talk about beauty, if it indeed has this there-ness to it, this experience of something there. Because I'll tell you right now, then my optimization becomes like, once I experience beauty, then my optimization is, why have I not experienced this in 5 days? Why am I unable to experience that when I do square bales? Why am I unable to do that in conversation? You now have a question of why doesn't the there manifest? Why doesn't the beauty manifest? Oh, I need to condition myself differently. I'm doing something wrong. And so that becomes like an experience personally for questions of conditioning, right? As opposed to sticking to the facts or sticking to the data. It's funny to think that there's a similar, in the same way that people like, what's the data say? What are the facts? There's a certain Occam's razors. What is an Occam's razor for beauty per se? An aesthetic Occam's razor, like cutting out the things that are not contributing to those conditions, right? Well, again, if indeed, and then I'll pass it to Jockin because I've said a lot, if though this is all something that is experienced by the subject as beyond the subject and yet participated in by the subject, this would seem to help you deal with the problems of religious wars, relativism, postmodernism, everyone in their VR headset, but do it in a non-totalitarian manner because the beauty measures you versus you measure it. And if you measure it, well, then you can capture it and impose that upon other people, right? Now, of course, this gets into, you know, where that's what they did with God, right? And the argument of religions has been, well, if you don't have a God, then you're doomed. You can't have a social order. And there seems to be legitimacy to that. But the funny thing is beauty is phenomenological. So you can't have a priest class telling you what beauty said and controlling you, right? They either create the conditions or the situations for that experience or they do not. And the government creates the social conditions according to their duties to create dwelling or not, and the ability of people to interact. So I think it begins changing how we think about the role of the institutions and the role of community and what kind of laws would you pass, et cetera, et cetera. But let me pass it to Jockin. Jockin.
You know, the question of scaling and that we're having, and I think I want to say something about beauty or connect it back from there. And the question of speech, you know, democracy that we were discussing. I think one of the things about scale, and scale is a very, very tricky question for philosophers to think for very particular reasons that I sort of wanted to sort of share and maybe get some of your viewpoints around. We forget that language, and Lacan sort of made this mistake or sort of developed this theory from there, that when he saw some kind of paternal function to be, in some senses, you know, active in language and necessary for humans to come into language, he quickly realized in the first decade of his, you know, towards his last decade, that a paternal function, a paternal metaphor in that what he called, doesn't need to be anchored in any content. It's a formal question, you know, in that sense. Anything in that sense can take the form of the paternal, you know, metaphor within Lacan. And that's how psychosis sort of became a problem for Lacan in late Lacan. And if we take that problem seriously in Lacan, we immediately realize that the master signifier is not master signifier because of what content or what meaning it has. It is a privileged signifier because how it is holding the signifying chain. Nothing else. It is in that sense only functioning, solving a, you know, a certain kind of practical function within the signifying chain, not because of what it is. If we take that seriously, we'll immediately see that no philosophy can actually take that privileged position because of what it is in any discourse, and philosophers can fantasize about it. We do, at different points. We do want our philosophies to become such that they can take the privilege function in the signifying chain because of what they are saying, not because of some random reasons that in certain social, cultural, political context, certain ideas become important. And they do. We all know that. That's, I think, the first point I wanted to make, that philosophers in that sense will never find a philosophical thinking which will become the master signifier because of what they are saying. That's not gonna happen. That's fundamentally not how language functions. And you mentioned it yourself, when you're saying presuppositionless and so on and so forth. Second, I think the point important becomes on the question of scaling. And I think fundamentally we miss something about scale. And there are a couple of things that maybe we can discuss. But the first important thing is that scaling demands, in some senses, responding to external circumstances rather than simply coming up and saying that I have the philosophy which can master all circumstances, or I have the idea which can master all. So that's a very easy way to fail in that process, which is why philosophies can't scale by definition. Philosophers, however, can play a role in the problems of scale in any social, cultural, political context. And they definitely can. There's no denying that. That role is open to thinking what that role can be. But philosophies as such, the more they enter into questions of scale themselves, the more they will fail. More their failure becomes very easily apparent to us. Because it's not because those philosophers were bad or those philosophies were bad. It's something about the way signifying chain language functions. That master signifier in itself can't, in that sense, hold its position because of its. And it does try to. Every time certain philosophies try to assert themselves because of what they are, we realize that they become totalitarian. We realize that they become oppressive. We realize that they become, and they can be great philosophies in themselves. So any over emphasis upon the master signifier itself in some way detaches us from the symbolic. That's what I think you were also mentioning. Given these, I think, basic facts which you all more or less would be able to come to terms with if we put our heads to it. The question becomes that how do we detach the problem of scale in some senses and respond to it separately? And I'm sure philosophies can play a very vital role within this question of scaling, because all philosophers can respond to those circumstances. And capitalism works precisely very, very good because capitalism realizes that it doesn't need to attach itself to any content of master signifier, which is why capitalism can very easily marry traditional values with modern markets, because it really understands master signifier is a formal question for capitalism. They don't know. Capitalism doesn't care if religion is a master signifier in some society, or some tribal god is a master signifier, or something else. Capitalism will function with all of these things. Only thing is, capitalism will exploit the master signifier. Capitalism will not show and show the gap of the master signifier. It will say, whatever is a master signifier, I'll work with it and I'll exploit it. I will not try and, in some senses, work through the gap of the master signifier. In that sense, so capitalism is a very healthy. It solves the problem of scale precisely because it understands the formal nature of the master signifier. That whatever the master signifier be, that is never, in some senses, an obstruction in some senses for further movement. The philosophers almost always get stuck with debates about master signifiers. You know, and one, I think, great thing Hegel did, and philosophy sort of fundamentally changed from that point, was he tried to detach from this emphasis upon master signifiers. He sort of showed us that you can develop any signifying chain up to a certain point, and the gap will become visible to you. You know, and that is what his phenomenology of spirit was. If you start reading it, it's basically developing these different, and he's a young man at that time when he's writing the book, and you should be honest about it. And he's sort of charting these different philosophical trajectories. And he's showing that when you develop them from inside, you don't need to sort of show why they are wrong. When you develop them from inside, they will automatically reach to their own contradiction. In that sense. And that is what the book was essentially sort of getting at. That each time you'll stumble back upon this contradiction, and each time you start developing something, you know, at least the first half of the book, after the phenomenology section sort of starts, self-consciousness section starts. You know, at least till that point becomes very clear, and then inverted image, the last point comes in. That story becomes important precisely because he's trying to show to us that whatever the content of that master signifier be, whatever those philosophies that you believe in, minute you develop them, you realize that they will start finding their own limits, and there is no sort of. So minute we start attaching ourselves too much with what our philosophies are, what do we believe in, what is the philosopher saying, what is, we realize that those debates become very detached from reality immediately, because those debates in some senses become I'll just quickly finish it. My only sort of provocation here would be that given these realities, how do we start thinking about problem of scale not as a simple problem of scaling a particular philosophical model? You know, rather asking the reverse question: what can a philosophical model do to scale the problem of scaling? Because what we are scaling is never a philosophical model. Scaling is a process that is automatically happening, or in some senses failing independently of the philosophical models that exist. It is something that is happening through us as human communities and as human beings. What can philosophies add to that process? And I think I'll just leave to that question. I'm sorry, I just took a long time. So, yeah.
That was outstanding. I think it is extremely important that you must be scaling a form, because if you're scaling content, it's totalitarian. You know, you're forcing something. There's an oppression there, right? And so what's interesting, and then alas, I will have to go. I've really enjoyed this. If anyone has final things to say, please. What is interesting is that philosophy itself, the philosophical act, might be a form that has some sort of organizing subject or practice, some organizing principle of the subject that makes them more open to the other to help global pluralism from exploding. So what the question would be, the scaling is the freeing of speech act, because the question would be, can you scale freedom of speech? And I would have to justify all of this. Can you scale freedom of speech? And then the role of philosophy in that thing is to keep it presuppositionless so it continues more orbiting. So what you're emphasizing is not content, but the preserving of that orbiting form. And that would be what you would be interested with. And the question would be, the argument would be, if Dietrich McCloskey is correct, that times of rhetoric, times of free speech, Jonathan Routes, all of these things actually create science, innovation, wealth, happiness, community, and all of these different things. And so what you're trying to do is preserve the form of free speech, that then we're in huge trouble, because the day we think free speech is expression of the individual, it's a mere expression of content, sharing of content, as opposed to what really matters about free speech is speech that is engaging in a freedom as a form that has an orbiting principle to bring difference together into community that also generates creativity, innovation, political forms, dwelling, and so on and so forth. So the form of freeing speech is what philosophy is in the business of, because philosophers are really good of noticing when presuppositions sneak in, or when people are not conditioning to beauty and stopping that. So the act of the philosopher has to be to keep you in the formulation, to keep you in the form, to keep you in the speech, more so than the philosopher giving you the content to talk about. Now, the reason why the question of lack and limit and all of these things is very important is because if you emphasize free speech, why in the world should you ever think that merely doing that would lead to certain developments of the subject in the manners that we've so described? Well, if you can make an argument or have reason to believe that there is something ontological about lack, and then there is also something generative about encountering limits and something critical about surprise, then if you create an environment of free speech and the freeing of speech, then it would not be you as a human being imposing content upon people. They would, given those ontological conditions, emergently develop in a certain way, given those conditions. Because all we have to ask is, do we think every single person on planet Earth, regardless of race, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, consists of lack and limit? Do we think so? Is that a presupposition, or is that just part of the structure of finitude itself? Well, I think it's part of the structure of finitude itself. And if also lack and limit is all that is needed for an experience of beauty, not guaranteed, but a possibility of it, then we have ontologically in the conditions of the subject the material needed for what we have been describing. And the question would be, how do you create the form for that to transpile, which would not be the transfer of content? Now, I think you also made an extremely good point, where the moment you try to scale philosophy, it's not going to occur. All you could ever scale possibly is form. I love the phrase, you know, obviously Hegel tells us that the owl of Nineveh flies at dusk, which means people don't tend to change how they think to a historic devastation, and everyone's kind of, you know, dying and stuff. So you tend to have a historic forcing function to make people take on new ways of thinking. And so philosophy, funny enough, but all philosophy can do is wait for the forcing function of history to catch the world with new conditions of possibility to show those things. That's one model. So I'm going to put two models of historic change. The owl of Nineveh flies at dusk because the dusk makes the owl fly. It's the new thinking tends to emerge when the dusk shows up. And then people are like, let's look around and see what the heck we did wrong. And people tend to be open. The philosopher almost never convinces people to be open until World War II or World War I, the trauma of World War I. Then we see modernist literature. It's hard to imagine Virginia Woolf or movements of art without World War I and World War II or the Cold War. The way the humanities formulate and people's receptibility to it does seem to be tied to historic bad things. This would be the crucifixion model, really, because you would need that. And philosophy then, as Hunter talks about, or Randall Collins, it changes the world if it has created the conditions of possibility for people when they look for it to see a different condition of possibility, and their receptibility of it is higher. And it tends to start with a minority, maybe 4%, but you get a few schools here, a few institutions there that are open to it because of the historic episode. Then it enters into the frame of quantification. It can possibly begin to spread, but it has to have, unfortunately, that historic forcing function, which then in a funny way may mean the meta crisis is wonderful because it will actually force people to consider different possibilities, assuming it doesn't, you know, kill us all. The other way that seems to be that philosophy might have an effect on history is if it inspires someone to change laws or to be an activist. Like a good example would be Hannah More, great biography by Karen Pryor. She was an abolitionist, and she believed because of her view of the Bible and Christianity, she engaged in changing the laws, networking, get people interested to get rid of slavery. And I think you'll see that philosophy that changes into action and then trying to critically change laws. This is where a lot of people mess up. They engage in, yeah, there you go, sadly. But, you know, we're all here and we're friends, Philip. So even if we're screwed, there's hope. One of the reasons why a lot of philosophers have made mistakes is because they have critiqued entire systems or tried to convince people that entire systems are bad, versus go in on particular laws or particular issues. And the critical thing is you go in for the issues that are incubators, not merely a single issue. So for example, if I wanted to change the speed limit on Ward's Road, okay, it goes from 50 to 45. That's not the law that really changes conditions of possibility versus I petition to give people in the neighborhood access to Zoom and high-speed internet. And I implore the state to make that infrastructure investment. Well, now you're talking about an incubator because people, how they spend their free time and what they think could change, right? That seems very different from the law that simply makes it illegal to go 50 miles per hour, right? So you target laws that incubate different things. Now, Keep in mind, though, if you incubate stuff, you may get a Lovecraft. No guarantee you're going to get a love. You might get a disaster. So the philosophers should be effing careful before they start incubating things. And most of the times they screw up. Unless the law, here's the critical thing when you do the analysis, the laws that tend to create incubators increase competition, honestly. And this is where more of the Austrian capitalist people make a good point. So for me, an example of a law I'd like to shift is basically the laws on certification, regulation, and the college monopoly on credentials. They have a certain monopoly. There's also a certain expectation, not because college is bad. Actually, what I would like is to remove the monopoly to bring costs down so more people can do it, the quality could go up, and actually it might be good for college. I would argue that introducing, if you're a capitalist, or you tend to believe that competition can be good, well, then you need to think about certification and regulation. Now, if you don't have any certification, that could have a risk because it's an information sorting mechanism, but we have to think about those things. But here's the point. Philosophy that is merely trying to convince people of content doesn't tend to do much until the forcing function, and only to the degree that people have the conditions of possibility that now they're open to it, or they look to change laws, to pass amendments, and that will change the incubation, but then you may get an unintended consequences like the American Civil War, where they say, well, if you're going to get rid of slavery, we're going to segregate, et cetera, so forth, right? So there can always be, so there may be at the end of the day an inevitability of a dusk in some form or another. But the critical thing is, if you say, well, let's try to change laws, because I don't want to have World War III be the forcing function, I'd like to preempt it. Well, then the question is, what is your philosophy of reality that would give you reason to think that changing these laws would have an increase of the average attunement to beauty versus not, right? Well, then have you had philosophical discussions to figure out if lack seems to be essential? Have you had philosophical discussions to give you reason to think that the freeing of speech has a negotropic function? Do you have a reason to think that changing laws in X, Y, or Z way, wow, I was European for a moment and said Z. I'm so proud of myself because all the Americans say Z. I had the European moment there. Do you have reason to think that focusing on these laws or this school system or this classroom in X, Y, or Z way, I did it again, would actually lead to an increased probability of the experience of attunement with beauty? Well, you won't if you haven't had philosophical discussions, nor would you raise your kids to show that alternative. No, would you yourself engage in that alternative to show these different things. But so the funny thing is, without philosophy, you have no idea what to do per se. And yet as a philosopher, you also have to accept that all you can do is be faithfully present to the conditions of possibility that you may be thinking, but you cannot necessarily scale, because any means by which you would do so would run the risk of trying to force a content upon people that could be oppressive. So those things then, but then if you can make the argument, as I think you can, that basically wealth creation, innovation, global pluralism, geopolitics, and all of that are contingent upon bringing in this spread of rhetoric, to use McCloskey's language, then I think you bolster your case, especially in a world that's looking at a meta crisis or whatever crisis you want to talk about, although we have to be careful to justify everything with crises, right? It's a weird thing, because if you say we have to stop emissions because of global warming, well, then you might just cause mass poverty, right? So you don't want to do that. But this is where the presupposition thing is important, because you say, yes, we're aware that there could be problems. That's why we're doing this work. And I have problems in my own life I'd like to work toward. And I think it would be good if they scale, but all I can do is have a faithful presence. So there's annihilation. And I think that's the best part about the negative pragmatism, is that you're doing the work of something that can spread, but negating from you the action of actively scaling, only pointing to what could create the possible incubations of that scaling if the forcing function of history were to bring it about, or if there were reasons for more and more people to think that. But the only way that you could have that non-totalitarian possibility of spread is to engage in something that would attract people. Because attraction is is a form of bringing in without force, right? Well, then that's the language of doing something beautiful. That's the language of trying to do something beautiful. Those conditions of possibility that you're working have to be something that engage in something beautiful. So then if people begin looking for them, they would be attracted to what they see. And you have to do that now, because if you wait, it's too late. But since we're all here for the friendship anyway, it all works out. So friends, Javier Rivera, I saw you on mute, please.
Yeah, I just want to briefly, I know you have to go. I just want to briefly talk about, because you brought to mind this idea for me that the problem that we have is that there's also this rhetoric of the semblance of lack. it's rhetoric. It's all relative. I don't want to accept any normative things. But that maneuver, and this is the thing, and Thomas Jockin was getting at this in the talk. Lack has that double function of being a kind of is a deceiver. It's a deceiver, right? And this is why the ancients didn't want to talk about lack that much, because they were afraid of the deception. But this is why I like what you're saying. But it's so hard to get at this semblance of lack, this pronouncement, utterance of yes, but it's all relative, and so on. But they're not really, and I think you guys were getting on this, the effective notion of lack. What does it really mean to say, yes, this is my opinion? You know, because what you see is that people say this is my opinion to guard their lack, to assert it in the most dominant way by saying that it's my opinion and it's just all relative. But I still agree with you. I'm just saying, like, I think there's this rhetoric of semblance of lack, which is problematic. Like, there seems to be a domination. I think Zizek got to this too, right? It's like this idea of the passive authority. That's like, yeah, whenever you want to see your grandfather, go ahead, see your grandfather. But I want you to see your grandfather when you want to see your grandfather. This is like, yeah, I think it's a problem, but I think it's mainly a problem because it can't really encounter the lack that we're talking about.
No, I think that's very well put. I mean, to me, that is why lack has to be encountered. Like, if it is thought, it's going to be that deceiver because it's going to be an image. And then, this is what's interesting. If we take that virtual category, I couldn't bring, that was, have to bring that back up. Virtuality outside the encounter almost seems like it has to be a problem. Imagination separate from the encounter almost has to get in the way of the unfolding of the potentiality of the actual, to use a hyphen phrase, right? So the problem is the ancients were quite wise. They're like, really, you're going to think about lack? That's like, no. But it's also, you can get into all like the mystic practices where they would say no to make you do, because if they didn't say no, you wouldn't do. But the doing is then the unveiling of the thing that you were talking about, but it had to be an action. Like, you had this ancient tradition of there were some things you can't say. You have to say no to get them to do, and all these paradoxical moves, which makes sense if there's an ontological lack or some sort of ontological contradiction and all these fun things, right? Like Hegel talks about. I think also, to Chitan's excellent point on Hegel, to tie this idea that there is no change till the exhaustion. If we look at sociologists, like I'll just look at Hunter, or I like Hunter's book on Change the World. Philosophy that was done 50 years ago is what people are now on average talking about. Like, the ideas of today are what in 50 years people talk about. Once the current ideas exhaust themselves, that's the issue. Like, they have to, you don't change things until that exhaustion point. That's exactly right. And then the ideas that people are thinking, people turn to. But here's the problem. If the ideas of people having now suck, then people turn to ideas that lead to fascism, wokeism, all the kind of force, right? So we want to make sure that the ideas that people turn to when you reach that exhaustion point or different ways of life are not contributing to extremism, all sorts of problems, right? But this is the funny thing. What this means, following Chitan and what you were saying, is that philosophy is indivisible from the encounter act. And you see, the issue is there's almost something difference between pragmatism and encounterism or surprisism or something. Like, this is what's interesting. What we are talking about, all of this philosophy about conditions of possibility, aesthetics, beauty, annihilation, letting go, all of these things are actually situated in a kind of encounterism. And they are not thinkable or doable or sensible outside the encounter itself, which, if you're here on Zoom, that means you're not in the encounter because you're here on Zoom. So you're talking about something that only makes sense in a situation that cannot be talked about, because if you were surprised, you wouldn't be talking philosophy, you would be beholding. So you're trying to talk about something that, if you're talking about it, means you're probably outside the limit of that encounter. Which then, if your philosophy was nothing based or overly being based, that wasn't an issue. Because, yeah, we don't need the encounter to discuss being in the classical sense, right? Actually, the best way to talk about being is in this kind of place. This is a great place, contemplatio in the Catholic notion, right? We're basically suggesting that no true form of contemplatio or dwelling or beauty is possible outside an encounterism. And it, to make up a word, because I got to get my quota before I die, I think I'm around 62, I got 18 left, encounterism. And encounterism is nice too, because it inherently has a negativity, but also an opportunity. Like an encounter is a possibility, right? But it's also negative because you ran into something, right? Pragmatism as a term, and Maurice Blondel was good on action. He's like, well, let's talk about action. But even action is not as, dare I say, precise enough as I think we're all getting at. We're pointing to the encounter, the radical moment of the encounter, and the moment as such is the event. Not this breaking through from being the encounter is the event, of which then colors everything that you think is possible and how you think forever. You can have one experience of beauty, and the world is forever a place where beauty is possible, even if it only happens for 1 second. This encounter transforms what's possible in the world. And thus you can change as a subject because you change the world that you're relating to and yourself, right? So there's something about, there's the issue is I have with the eventology, the event that everyone talks about, is I think it's getting at it, but that is being language to most, almost, right? It's too being-y. Not that I'm against, it just depends on what you mean. It's too being-y. But the language of the encounter, capital E, encounter, that's inherently particular. That's inherently surprising. It inherently has a negativity, but it's not nihilistic. It is inherently an action. It inherently is a call on you. It means it's measuring you because you couldn't have predicted it. It also would entail beauty. It is a kind of event, but it's also not reducible to a preset schema. And so it seems like a philosophy that is centered on a encounterology is getting at what we're talking about and has an orbiting principle. As well. And so, again, even, encounterology, and that's, of course, pluralism, open to the other, glimmers, all of these different things, but also what it would mean to, and then I'll give it to Mr. Winn. If in encounterology, you are directing your negativity or saying that's too positive, et cetera, so forth, toward that which takes you away from the encounter. And that's how it's not ultra nihilistic. That's the problem, right? Like the Julie Rest could lead you to an ultra nihilism if you're not careful, right? It depends. But then she emphasizes the hospice. Well, what is a hospice? An encounterology. Like everything that she seems to point to that leads away from this ultra nihilism that you risk is found in the encounter. Well, let's emphasize the encounter then. Let's emphasize it. What does a presupposition do? Keep you from the encounter. What are we saying leads to historic change? You are ready for the encounter with the forcing function of history because you've changed the conditions of possibility for the encounter with the forcing function and different things. Now, I think many people, when they talk about the event, are talking about an encounter. They're talking about a thing that you can only know in the encounter. You're waiting for the event. So I am not saying that a lot of these philosophers, when they talk about the event, are not also talking about the encounter. But here's why I also prefer the encounter language is because the event doesn't happen every single time you run into your neighbor, but an encounter does. And I would want to have a language that emphasizes a daily event that is in the encounter that requires a certain conditioning to its openness. And maybe if everyone does that, you can get a larger speculative reason of event of a Quentin who talks about the raising of the dead and all of that different stuff that is possible because of that radical contingency. And it's giving Bergson's duration. That's lovely. And so to me, the emphasis on the encounter gives you the event, but makes the event daily, constant, regular, and found in your conditioning to the openness of the surprise. But let me give it to Thomas Winn. Mr. Winn.
I have a way that you can overcome nihilism in your encounterology, basically. Basically, I think, because what Heidegger says, like, being is that which lets itself appear as a lack. Being is that which conceals itself. Being is that which discloses itself in its history, like the way that we come to understand it, the way that Schopenhauer understood it, the way that Plato understood it. For Heidegger in this later period, it's like being discloses itself in different ways, because what being fundamentally is that which lets itself be disclosed in any way, in whatever way. And I think this is what you mean by the encounterology. Like, you're encountering a disclosure, and you're not talking about the content of the disclosure. You're not talking about the content of a specific community. It's about allowing yourself to encounter that community in terms of beauty or peace, or, you know. And I think what fundamentally grounds a knowing in that ology, encounterology, is the knowing that being is letting you be disclosed to whatever comes to be disclosed. And I think when then you recognize that, you're recognizing that being is not lack. Being is that which lets itself appear as lack in certain moments or in a historical epoch, which is ours. Like nihilism is quite prominent today, the meaning crisis, you know. And I think if you take that perspective from Heidegger and say that, well, being is that which gives itself to me, I can't dictate being on its own terms, then I'm released to it. And then you can say, well, maybe being is that which is releasing me to it, as that which is releasing me to it, as that which is. And I think this is what Javier is commenting, like the lack of the lack. Like, even if I had a presupposition about lack, I find that that's lacking. So that must mean that being itself is the lack of the lack, you know? This is Zizek's move, and Zepuncic's move is like, there's a division of the vision. So when I say like, okay, there's being on one side and knowledge on the other, even the knowing of being itself is divided. Even thinking is divided. So I just encounter this consistent like stuckness or division. I think that's why their ontologies are quite smart in that sense of lack. Like, okay, even the lack, even my presupposition concerning being is lacking. But at that exact moment, I think Heidegger is quite important or good or helpful, because you say, well, being is, all being is at that point then is the letting which lets me experience that experience of it being a lack. But it doesn't mean that being is a fundamentally an ontological lack, because I need to be more skeptical than to just ontologize being as a lack, you know. I think that constant opening then means we can say, well, perhaps being is that which releases me to let me see it as that which lets, you know. I think this is what we mean. Like, this is like the thing, like I'm breathing anyway. I don't need to consciously, continuously decide to breathe as if that's my only opportunity, like my only choice above like the lack of breath. No, breath is given to me. In some moments, lack appears to me, you know. Normally when I've tried to attain something which wasn't existing, you know, or I thought it, you know. I think this is where grace comes in. I think in terms of community, like this is the full circle, like if we recognize that, okay, we don't need to have like a fundamental awareness of lack in each community. Instead, we say, well, it's about giving over to different interpretations, because being is that which is allowing that person to experience philosophy as that in their own particular way, you know? And you start to see how, well, I can encounter their philosophy or their perspective, open myself up to it, and recognize that it's not nihilism, because actually being is giving that person's being their being to them and to me. And this is what gathering means. It's like letting yourself be open to what they have to say, or what the bridge tells you, like in the sense that it brings to mind things, you know. I think this is what it means to be dwelling. And Philip's question, like, is lack given? This is what Heidegger would say, being es gibt in German. So like the way that in German you say there is something, you say like es gibt, there is es gibt, which means it gives. Like it gives this bottle, you know, it gives my phone. Instead of saying there is a phone, like es gibt. So what Heidegger says is like, actually, this being gives this over to me in experience. Is lack given? Yeah, in some moments, but being is that which gives lack. Being is not lack, you know? And that's why being is not even presence for Heidegger, because presence, or like what's actually just there existing, is what he calls beingness. Being is that which gives beingness, you know? And this is when you start to see, and it's not like this mythical figure of being which is there giving. It's like literally the fact that it's giving, you know. I think this is really important to understand with Heidegger, because then you can get why we have to let things be, because things are given of themselves, you know. And that's why we don't need to achieve anything. It's like achieving nothingness is to say, well, achieving lack is to recognize that even lack is something given in particular moments, especially today in the meaning crisis, you know.
No, that's lovely. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. Yeah, I'm going to wear a name tag that says Encounterologist and just go around and people are like, oh, you're a doctor. Yes, I am. I think it's interesting, too, because it's like taking Heidegger there. We don't have to achieve anything. We just have to condition ourselves for the thing that we don't have to achieve, like the encounter of it, to be able to condition and attune ourselves to it. I think that then is speaking to this notion of this, because if we have limit and we entail lack, we don't have to achieve anything. We have to condition ourselves to this thing. That's hilarious. Condition ourselves to this thing that we have so we can encounter with it. Because it's almost like the problem is dwelling. If we Illich, Heidegger, all these things, encounter is the challenge to the dwelling. When you encounter something, then that's when you lose dwelling because you're overwhelmed by otherness or surprise or whatever. So if we want to maintain encounterology in all of its forms, then encounterology, you could say, is the study or the way to think the possibility of dwelling in all circumstances, in all situations, how to maintain dwelling. And global pluralism is the greatest difficulty for dwelling in this sense. So encounterology would be a focus on how does one maintain dwelling? And what you're talking about is scaling in encounterology in a sense. And I like the word too, as we talk, is because it's almost like ontology, epistemology, encounterology, which I think aligns with Heidegger there, exactly what you're saying, because what you're letting be and the being will encounter. There's a letting the encounter. There's a letting you encounter the being as opposed to trying to achieve, because the achievement keeps you from the encountering, right? So you're open. There's a certain opening and clearing for encounterness or unfolding and furling, et cetera, so forth. And the reason why I think this is important is because basically all social contracts are based on an ontology. What is a human? Human rights. Well, what is the human being? Epistemology. That's what you teach. That's what you think. But what would it look like to think political science or economics not according to an ontology, but say an encounterology? And that's different than the social, like it's usually social contract, but the risk there is the majority over the minority, or the individual doesn't matter as the collective. These are all problems. But what if the emphasis is on the encounterology? So encounter contract per se, right? And you're basing the social contract, because social is basically saying the individual will encounter the other. We'll just turn it up a notch. Let's talk about the encounter contract. What do we as a society do? What do we as a society do to make people capable of encountering without losing dwelling? We don't think that. We think, what do we do to make sure people have food and shelter? Okay, you'll get a job, then you'll make money, and you will not starve. That's the entire education system, right? But what if instead you thought it according to encounterology and asked, what do we have to teach so that people can encounter otherness and not lose dwelling, which of course includes human rights, but is not reducible to human right. It includes food and shelter, but it's not reducible to food and shelter, because without those things, you can't encounter anyone because you're dead, or you're alone, or you're not able to have the infrastructure. But to think of the social contract as an encounterology, as an encounter contract, would transform how you think about politics, how you think about all these things. And it automatically also removes the majority minority problem, individual over the collective. You're removing those things because you're putting the focus on creating the capacities to maintain dwelling regardless of encounter. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
There's something I think there's an important distinction, is that obviously when we say being in such a general term, there's a chance for misunderstandings, because what are we addressing? I think it is useful to make some distinctions between existence and being, for example, or the more classical mode would be essence and existence, right? That typical Aquinas mode of talking about it. I just say that because, for example, again, we're kind of hinting at it on previous net calls, where if we don't say things come from nothing, everything must come from something, that means possibilities have to come from somewhere. Thus, being has included actuality and potential. Like, it's a larger grouping. But existence, now that's a more particularized point, right? This kind of hexity of this particular event or this particular person or whatever. I only say that because so in that context, I think Thomas's point that is being lacking, that's fair. I think actually that is, I think, a reasonable argument being made. But I would come in and say, is existence lacking? I would say yes, absolutely. And I think that's the thrust point, because the direct encounters of reality in front of us, individual things in front of us, is always lacking. In fact, they're a bunch of dust. Like, that's kind of the point. Like, I'm using a very aggressive mode of like gradations of existence, gradation of being, right? And by saying like, no, individual things are existing, they do exist, but they're always lacking, always. But it's interesting. That's kind of the thrust point. Now, there's a whole secondary effect from that, under what quantum, like what measurement and what thing we're talking about in the lack. What are we talking about? But the fact that there is change, like you can build on this point, I think that individual substances change and that there's an underlying thing that exists that undergoes the change, blah, 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 all this stuff. But I want to posit that like that's a tension point. I think I just need to be clarified. By the way, Daniel, this whole question of like, I refuse to make this an ism, encounterism. I hate that. But I think something you're bringing up, I think that is really useful or is interesting, is that the general point of, if we're in states of radical change, so the example, the argument of AI intervention, right? I'm just using something more practical to kind of ground this. If we're in a state where the old models of education, of how we're supposed to teach people, aren't going to work because the reality those students are going to enter into is just completely different. You cannot give them a prescript model of like learning certain things. We have to prepare them for an encounter, to be responsive to the situation, to the encounter, the event that is presented in front of them. That only thing we can do is get them prepared for that, and that's generally not going to be kind of very particularized training. It's going to be, actually, there's an argument for basically the fundamentals, right? Humanities, history, things like that. The argument is that these are flexible instruments that can be used to address the encounters that things run into. I'm just reminded of that when you were talking, Daniel. But yeah, that's all I got. I'm close.
Well, I tried to go for an ology versus an ism. So, we go for that encounterology versus encounterism. So maybe that helps. But I appreciate what you're saying, because I think also on that point between being existence, you're exactly right. And I think the idea that existence is always lacking because it's outside the finite frame. We could use the freak theory from Ebert, because there's always an excess, but you experience that as a lack because it's beyond you, and thus can be a -1 as the teacher. It's not a 0 because you experience it, right? And that then is interesting because the encounter that is situated in the finite frame creates that experience in existence of the lack. And I think on the question of being, yeah, like to me, I'll talk about another ology, alterology on the question, do we follow with Peter Rollins? And you see that there's lack in being itself, or being entails anything, God, theology, all of those different things that I think is very fair. And you can make arguments to move in that direction. So I think the clarification is exactly right. I think that's spot on. I think also, yes, I did have to go a long time ago, but you guys are so great. It's hard to. I definitely think when we think about also lack, what's interesting about lack is as a present absence, it is inherently an encounter. A present absence has to be encountered. Otherwise, it's absent or present. Like a present absent has a fundamental encounter baked into it, like a relation that's kind of baked into it. That then the question is that present absence calling on you, or you calling on it? And that seems to be the danger of lack, that the classics were like, it's like, nah, the moment you start talking about present absence, people start using it for magic, or using it for their own interests, or to escape themselves. There's some danger there. But this is the question. Are we reaching the moment of exhaustion in history where it was actually quite good to not think lack until now, because there were certain exhaustions or contradictions that have to arise? And is there something about this particular historic moment that, because you've gone through certain contradictions and development, where now, dare I say, you're conditioned to handle lack, where up until this point, the classical guys were exactly right. But now, perhaps there's some sort of conditioning to be able to deal with this very dangerous thing. And I do wonder if history at these kind of episodes or moments of excess or contradiction that Hegel's talking about are in some regard decided by dealing with some dangerous thing. It might always be some sort of dangerous thing that decide these moments when the contradiction appear themselves. I mean, when contradiction becomes undeniable, there's a risk there that it overwhelms, right? And it's almost as if lack is the thing that's emerging, dare I say, that was always latent, but is there. That's the dangerous thing that has to be considered now. And then the question is, what is the framing by which best to do it? And I think keeping it, for me, what's interesting, and then I'll give it for Winn, and then I will run. This is a 3-hour net. I just love you guys. You're just so great. There's something I wonder, in the same way that Kant was like, well, I'm going to have this noumenon thing to protect God and theology from reason, like I'm going to protect faith from reason, right? And there's something like now I think it's more complex, but there's something about that that's kind of understandable. Is there a way in which encounter protects lack from becoming dangerous? Like it's a way of saying, I'm going to keep lack in that place where it doesn't become an image that leads to all of those problems that they were talking about in the past. And I'm going to keep it in the surprise so that lack is always something measuring in us that we have to call to, that we can orbit around versus control, right? Because what's the alchemist temptation, the Faustian temptation to take something like lack and control it, right? Well, if you say, nah, you have to encounter it. And by the way, when you encounter it, it's effing clear you can't control it. Like when you encounter beauty, it's darn clear you can't be Faustian on this one. So if you keep it in the encounter, I almost feel like it's the ritual, keeping God behind the veil temple, like keeping God in the, like there's a certain sort of, is encounter the ritual, you know, that in the past was what maintained a kind of distance between man and God, that once you cross that distance, there's all sorts of risks that come with it, even if there's some regard where you have to think it or whatever, that's a topic. But there's something where is encounter the, dare I say, boundary, risk, line, whatever, that then keeps lack from becoming this dangerous thing that at this particular historic moment, we're ready to think and employ because we've exhausted previous historic episodes. So is there something about the emphasis on the encounter that becomes a certain binding principle? And maybe also that applies to beauty, because when we separated beauty from the encounter, it just became pretty and art, and we killed it, right? Because when you look at Plato and the classical, beauty is encountered. And like when you cut, like you don't just, you have to think to encounter it, but you can't reduce the encounter to your thinking. There's always a certain limit there that's for your sake. Like when I look at like God saying, hey, Moses, get behind this cleft of the rock. That's for Moses' sake, not God's sake, right? So is there something about the encounter being the principle that limits lack that's for our sake, so that lack and beauty in these things don't then get reduced or pulled under our own power, which leads to all sorts of pathologies? Maybe, you know, Dimitri a few weeks ago or years ago, I don't know anymore, just time's so fast with you people, is that this idea that the Nazis used beauty to control, right? Now, we made arguments that wasn't in the sense that was made, but maybe the likelihood of not having beauty used by the Nazis in a problematic way, that is controlled if you keep beauty in the encounter. Beauty has to be encountered or you're not talking about it. You know, beauty, lack has to be encountered or you're not talking about it. And then it's not merely relativistic, because it is found in the surprise of the lack, of which is qualitative, not quantifiable, so it's not reducible, and it clearly has a measure on you, and it is found in an encounter where it comes and goes as it wills, but you can condition yourself according to that encounter, that you can try to then meet more often by conditioning yourself to experience it more so. So by keeping it in the encounter, that seems to have a certain binding principle that keeps you from trying to move it to power, and then keeps you from making these mistakes of thinking beauty is pretty, or beauty is a nice piece of music, right? Or that good is taste, right? All of these reductions we now have, truth is fact, good is opinion, beauty is pretty. Would the encounter keep that from occurring? It seems to me like it would. And also the other, if the other has to be encountered, you can't start reducing the other to some sort of principles of identity and then have quotas and different things, because the other is encountered or they're not other. They're a totality. The infinity must be encountered or it's the totality, or different things.
Thomas, I'll quickly say this. The question of -1 actually is, and Thomas, you can respond to it as well, I'm saying it before you, that in existence and in being, in both cases, lack is never zero. Which essentially means lack does not mean that there is some question that we can never answer. It's not something fundamentally lacking in the being. It is that there will always be a question in a particular system that will be left unanswered from within the system. And again, you will find something else, you find something else. So being complete or lacking, that debate becomes very different within that context. Yeah, just please go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
I'll just note, like, it gets interesting into, like, if we dare say theology or different things, like if you have is there a trinity that's like a -1 because each person isn't the other person's, or is that a +1? It's interesting to think that being, it could have a +1, it could have a -1, it could have a creative where it's complete in itself, but it's the highest form of activity is found in that being. I think, like, there's also that idea that being is the highest form of activity that I think Mr. Jockin is saying, not sort of this kind of rest space, but it's interesting to think those kind of differences, because it seems like finitude in its frame of understanding, as Ebert will emphasize, has this -1 characteristic to it. And then it gets interesting, because if we talk about being in kind of a theological classical sense as distinct from existence, then it seems like if God is if God has some sort of, or being +1 or -1 or relation that's part of him, that can be considered, or the being has a certain, I guess I'm thinking, what is Martin with being without God, Marquez, I like him, where he talks about this kind of excessive saturation that entails God, where God is a radical particular saturation. Martin? No, that's Quaz Martin. I'll remember. Marion talks about God as this kind of excessive saturation, different things. That's quite interesting. But Mr. Winn, did you have anything else to say on this fine afternoon?
Basically, just reminding me of my reading of Heidegger's Hegel, where basically Heidegger sets forth a Hegel which passes through any thought which tries to ontologize lack. And then I read like Phenomenology of Spirit after my reading, and basically I came to this conclusion that Hegel talks about what he calls external cognition, or which is a characteristic of natural consciousness, the way that it approaches objects in the world. If it thinks that it will find a method of proof which belongs to its character, will always find a lack in that object, you know? It will always find an inconsistency. So I made a note saying, so this is going to be too long-winded, I think, for this time of night. But basically, it reminded me of another thing that me and Dimitri spoke about once, about his work concerning the sorrow of finitude, which is a part of the beginning of my research, where Hegel's saying, and I'll quote this one, this is from The Science of Logic. Hegel says, the understanding persists in this sorrow of finitude, that it makes non-being, which you can call lack, the determination of things, and at the same time, this non-being, it makes it imperishable and absolute. But a lot of Hegel's work is to talk through what he calls formalism, which always ends up in this kind of lack, because it cannot think the dialectical process. It just looks at objects, sees what you said, Thomas, it sees the existence of objects, it tries to determine some kind of truth in them, and it encounters a change or a becoming. So Hegel's task in a way is to set us onto the science of logic, to show us that there is a way of thinking about existence which can actually introduce a notion. And it's the notion which persists, Hegel, you know, of course, in a way which is even unifies basically existence or actuality with the notion. And I made a comment, like, when the subject is looked at as if it were an underlying subject, because Hegel uses the word underlying subject in distinction to this absolute subject, no content appears, and the subject is read as being barred through its inherent lack. And then I made a comment against Zizek, saying this is Zizek's reading of the empty space of subjectivity. So I think Zizek reads Hegel at that point where he ontologizes lack, you know. I think that Zizek reads Hegel like this. I think Hegel's actually trying to bring us through the sorrow of finitude, whereas I think Zizek stays there, actually. But yeah, that's my final comment.
It's very interesting that you have Lacan fighting an ontologization of the real, as he says. Like there's like in the book, Not To stresses that, be careful to make the lack ontological. And yet, phenomenology would say if you experience lack, what are the conditions of possibility that make it so you could experience it, which would have some sort of ontological ramifications, right? And so this is what is it exactly that's ontological? I think is very astute. But Mr. Jockin.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just want to jump in because I heard this, I mean, that quote that Thomas just brought up, where like that conflation of non-being with lack. No, I absolutely reject that. No, and that's like, if I make a summary point of like how Daniel and me connected was on this exact point. Lacks are not nothing. Like, I think I kind of come from the position like I don't even my comprehension what nothing is. Like, it's just that I think that's such a huge danger zone. Because that's the whole point is that lack is not this. It's not the same as non-being. Like that's kind of the drawing point over here. You know, I understand this whole argument of like number -1, but like that's the point is that even I make the argument is 0 is we treat that as nothing. It's not. It's the original operation of 0 as an object was a placeholder, right? It's to be a present absence so that things can parse through. Like that's kind of, so even that argument there, I'm not really, I think people are kind of making a misunderstanding of what I'm saying about lack of being equivalent to non-existence, or because that's the thing, is like that's kind of the again, like the non-being versus non-existence element here. Like technically potentials are non-existent, technically. They're being, but they're not existent. Like that's the point, is that unless whatever. I know this can get spiraled in 5 different directions, but just the drawing out point of kind of like what I think we're in play here is yeah, I mean that's the thing. I'm seeing Thomas put it like today people experience lack as a non-being and a non-being as a lack. Yeah, that's a misunderstanding of what we're getting here. I think I'm actually seeing actually example of how lack operates. Like I don't even think we have a real, and this is kind of, I remember this from Plato's discussion on kind of the sophists, where non-being, we don't even, like in our operation of language on it, doesn't seem to work. We can't even really get to it, because all we get is just these kind of weird contradictions. And then I think, Shaitan brought this up, right, where he talked about we kind of run incompletion, right? That every operation we kind of operate through, and then we realize it's not complete. Like there's something missing from that. I guess what I'm getting at here is, I guess I'm getting animated about it, because I generally do have a doctrine and argumentation of the ontological status of lack, because of I use different examples over time. That's why I'm not satisfied to just let it be a psychological state. I don't think that's good enough. For the examples, Daniel brings up like surprise, and it kind of has this interpenetrative nature. Also, it lacks act on us. I think that's kind of the whole point. Like why? But this is just what I want to draw.
I think one of the issues too is, as we were saying, history teams tend to have to push people before they consider new philosophies. I wonder sometimes if that actually applies to language itself, where when you go through history, many of the times, like when they're talking about nothing or being or different things, there wasn't the condition that would force the need for a more precise language or a more precise categorization. Whereas today it's like, wait, something was missed. That's why we have fallen into these problematic, say, neo-pragmatism of Richard Rorty. Not that I dislike Rorty entirely, or these kind of nihilisms or different things. Oh, maybe there was an ontological category that was missed, or that was spoken about by a language that suggested something different. And I definitely think that happens. When I read a lot of the apophatic theology or different things like that, you know, when they speak of God as nothing and then bright abyss or different things, there's something about a certain lack in that. It's a non-being that's a result of a relative frame. That's the issue, is most of the time when we talk about nothing, or when people talk about nothing, it's a certain relative, it's a certain conditional, it's a certain effect of a finite frame. I'll just keep using Ebert's language, that then we name or call nothingness, which then leads us to believe in the existence of nothingness, when that then blinds us from this ontological category of lack that is needed to think things like the Encounterology or beauty or things like that. So it's definitely interesting to think that the formation of language and its categories may be also something that is reflected a process of exhaustion in thought and in stories. Like, oh, like, and then it makes sense that people are like creating so many words online or new neologisms and different things, precisely because you're at a place where the language that history gave you must have missed something, because the language doesn't fit our experience, dang it. Just like Nassim Taleb saying, we got to come up with anti-fragile because this is not there. Or it was there, but wasn't to that term. Lack was in classical thought, but it was ignored or it wasn't seen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Mr. Winn, did you have something to say, my friend?
It's just, I feel like a lot of my reading of Hegel is like situates itself on this, and even a lot of my philosophy, although I know Heidegger doesn't agree with the point I have, which would be, I think that contradiction, even gap or lack, is itself only ever an effect of a type of knowing which attempts to achieve the object in the way that, like I put in the chat, that Hegel criticizes formalism, which means constructing knowledge towards an object which tries to get with the truth of the empirical and so sensible object of experience. Like that's where knowledge for a long time was situated, you know? I think if you approach thinking in that way, where you just try to like accurately represent an object at hand, you're going to find that there is no God. God is dead. And you're going to find that in the place of God, there is a lack. That's what nihilism is, in my opinion. Like, this is Nietzsche's work about European nihilism, is it became so overly rational with science, they encountered the meaning crisis because God died in the place of God. And what was left over in the symbolism was lack. And I think this is the point. Like, in the history of human beings, we experience lack as non-being because we don't know what to do after the death of God in terms of how we understand the symbol of being, you know? Like, being is nothing in our history in that sense. In the sense of being is lack. But my opinion is, like, lack or nothing, even nothingness in a way, the way we determine it, arises if we try to treat knowledge as if we could accurately represent being, like an object that's at hand for us, you know? So that's my question. I think this is why it is kind of like a return to the Greeks in a way, because it's saying that actually the Greeks approached being in a different quality. It wasn't about trying to accurately represent it as if it's at hand, as if it was like existence, because then you equate the two and then you find lack, you know?
Let me make sure I summarize. I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. So what your argument or your statement is that because of the priority of knowledge, right? And that from a priority of knowledge, the fact of contradiction, absences, things like that, has led to basically a collapse to thus assume lacks are nothing. Like, basically have non-being. To know is to be, basically knowledge, to know is being. Like, so there's a correspondence of those two. When we know something, it has existence.
Like, more like the way that we approach knowledge, this is what I like about Heidegger. He says, like, in different ways of understanding the way we experience things, we presuppose stuff about knowledge. So he would say within modern metaphysics, which became very mathematical, it became skeptical of what seemed to be dogmatic ways of approaching thinking, i.e. thinking about being, not being. It said, okay, those questions in metaphysics are now gone because Kant showed us we have to deal with the empirical experience, etc. And the idea is, when you turn to formalism, which means looking around you in phenomena scientifically, like philosophy became very scientific because it said, okay, we have to limit knowledge and deal with what's at hand. I think in that quality of experience of thinking, then when they tried to even question like the meaning of something, like the meaning of the social realm, then it would only encounter lack. But not because lack itself is ontologically the quality of being forever and ever, amen, or the quality of existence forever and ever. Instead, it's like a product of that quality of thinking. I think this is why I like, this is part of my philosophy, is like, there are different qualities of thinking. And if you try to do something with that quality, you might end up in a lack. You know, like, if you try to approach the question of love as if the person opposite you is like a calculator, and you try to calculate that experience, you'll find something which does not give, or it lacks in that sense, you know? So that was my question about your comment concerning existence. Like, existence is lacking, but maybe it's lacking because we're trying to, like when you mentioned the dust, like the changes and the becoming and death and everything, maybe if you're trying to find a meaning that persists beyond the dust, then you'll find a lack in that thinking, you know? That's my point. Like, yeah.
Well, I'll just note, for me, and Philip, good to see you again, sir. What has basically occurred, in my opinion, is the history of thought came to a place where they went, okay, we can't establish objectively the existence of things. Well, that must mean there's nothing. Okay, nothing exists. Which, of course, we sort of all paused and go, well, wait, that doesn't make any sense at all. Well, it has to be true because, you know, we found out there couldn't be any thingness, so I guess nothing exists. And because we were so kind of married to our epistemologies and ways of thinking and the death of God and whatever, we wouldn't even allow into our frame the thought that lack is not nothing. And so what ends up happening is basically we've interpreted lack as nothing, because the experience of lack, we choose how we interpret it. And here is the key, this is where I think the subject is so powerful, kind of to your point, if we choose to believe that lack is nothing, then it is for us Like nothing is there, which of course then no wonder you get auto-cannibalism in the meaning crisis and nihilism, because you have literally chosen to condition reality around you by your interpretation of lack and your absolute choice to be nothingness, which makes no sense. And so you get an absurd world. And basically what Jockin and I kind of on this idea, no, to say lack is not nothing is almost a, well, you could say kind of a political revolutionary claim. It's like, no, lack is not nothing. You can choose it as a present absence. You don't have to interpret lack as nothing, because if you choose, this is what I call, honestly, this is what the absolute choice, like the main absolute choice is the choice on how you interpret lack. And basically what we've done throughout history is chosen to interpret lack as nothing. Lack is nothing, which of course doesn't make sense, but we've done it, dang it, because it shows the power of sociological conditioning, tools, all of that, right? And what's happened in a sense is we're now at the meaning crisis, exactly right. We're now at the historic episode where postmodernism has failed us. You have all these different failures, and that's the forcing function that has made us go, maybe we missed something. And this is where Hegel's like, let's look back at history. And Jockin's like, hey, look, there's this category called lack. What if lack is not nothing? Oh my gosh, we have an opening. We have a clearing. But nothing, in a sense, exists as a kind of simulation or choice that humans can choose to make themselves toward that isn't actually there and makes no sense, but it shows you that we can live absurdly. This is the self-effacement. Like I'll talk about self-effacement. Self-effacement is when you choose that lack is nothing, right? And in that sense, nothing, the problem is because lack has causal impact on you, if you choose that it's nothing, then that works on you because it's not nothing, it's lack. That's the irony. That's why I'm always talking about irony. The irony is you can choose to interpret that lack is nothing, and because it's not nothing, it actually is lack. It will work on you, causally change you into an auto-cannibalistic fashion, right? So this is where it's so important to say, no, lack is not nothing. When we talk about nothing, although again, I totally understand what you're saying, because in the sense that we can believe in nothing and have it causally impact us, ergo collapse knowledge, that's very real, but it's real precisely because lack is a kind of gentleman. Lack allows you to make that misdesignation interpretation and form yourself accordingly. That leads to all of these pathologies. But if we instead go, no, lack is not nothing, and then I'll give it to Chiton, who in all of his wonder has returned to us at 6 a.m., is that if lack is not nothing, we have a door per se. And if we make the absolute choice to then commit ourselves to that lack that is not nothing, we can entertain a certain eventology, if you know, not eventology, encounterology. And that too is, I think, if lack is bound to the encounter, why that interests me is I think it's far more likely to choose that lack is a present absent versus lack is nothing. So that's another way I'll put it. And then when you talk about nothing, you're more likely to talk about it as no thing with a hyphen, which means that it exceeds your scope of intelligibility. It's an excess, which get Mr. Rivera, good to see you. It's like the only no thing there is something that has a kind of excess. It's not a thing, not because it's nothing, but because it exceeds the kind of scope. But get Chiton, please.
Just quickly, I think maybe for me, I think ground for discussion of lack is very interesting. I get very passionate about this discussion, but I just want the conditions to be set in the, I think we're interpreting lack in a little, in a way which will confuse us a little. Lack, at least in the Hegelian thinking, is a fullness of being. That's something we have to understand. Lack is not the point of simple incompletion in Hegel. Had that been the case, and that's the misinterpretation, many people sort of enter into it, and we, in Hegel, the problem, and there's an ontological question there, which we can have a longer discussion. I can go on for an hour on these things, but fundamentally, Hegel's problem wasn't simply that, oh, everything is incomplete. That's not what he was sort of getting at. He started a discussion from the point that for Aristotle, truth was in the non-contradiction. So if I'm here, I'm not in the bar, I'm not in the school, and that was truth for Aristotle. Hegel reversed its opposition. Hegel said there is truth in the contradiction itself. It's that reversal that starts this journey of lack in a very particular way, where the problem itself is not incompleteness. If it's fundamentally incomplete, that's not an issue. There are things which are incomplete in this world. The problem is a reverse one. that how incompleteness itself becomes a point of fullness of being in that sense. You know, the limitation itself becomes the point of some kind of a encounter with truth in that way. That reversal, which is why it's called a -1 again, because there will always be some questions within a certain symbolic frame which cannot be answered within it, but doesn't mean that question cannot be answered. That question can always be answered without, but it will always raise new questions that cannot be answered. So it's not simply there are some questions that we can never answer. It's not that kind of thinking, which is why it's a fullness of being. The challenge between Heidegger and Hegel is not simply, which is why this is easy thinking that Heidegger has being and Hegel doesn't have being. Hegel has lack. Both can be interpreted very easily into this question of fullness of being. That's not a problem. The challenge is how do we conceptualize ontology? And that's a whole another discussion. Which side we fall into is a different discussion altogether. You know, but how we operationalize ontology itself in the framing of philosophy, that's a much deeper problem, which we probably can't do it here in this way. But it's not simply, neither of them were fools in that sense. Neither of them they simply saw that, oh, if there is being or there is no being in that sense, we will get a result where we will get some kind of a zero or some kind of a absolute lack or absolute fullness of being in that sense. Both saw that problem in very clear ways. Heidegger saw that there's a complete being, but that being is always cut out from us. So he also plays a -1 in that manner. And Hegel also plays it in the reverse way. He said there is a fundamental lack, but that lack is always full of being. So both sides become, interpretable. Yeah, I'll just sort of quickly finish here. Thanks.
No, I think it's brilliant. I'll give it to Jockin. And then I should really go and get Belonging Again 2-1 ready for publication. I'm going to be up to like midnight. I think what's critical here is incompleteness is on the side of understanding, which you choose absolutely what is that incompleteness? And you say, is that incompletion? Is it a result of, again, I'll just use Ebert's language because I just find it so useful here, because if being is passing over to nothing, dialectical, and then you get this becoming. So you have this incompletion that seems to define you, but is that ontological? You have to make that choice. But if you say, wait a minute, what would it even mean to say that being itself is kind of ontological? That doesn't seem like it would make sense. And you say, well, what if the incompleteness of being that would have to somehow be complete at the same time on the side of reason with the I in parentheses is actually time-space that is full, but the future is entirely open. So the incompleteness, the notness, is the contingency of the creative unfolding. And I think that's when Hegel talks about resolution, and I know Dylan Shaw was talking about this, and I think it is true, the subject is to resolve themselves to that openness of the future that then makes the incompleteness the openness of the future, but the future isn't there because of time-space, and it's virtual, therefore it's complete and yet unfurling. That's what's weird. Like it's a complete unfolding. It's a thing that's complete unfolding. And so the incompleteness is dancing. It's an incompleteness that is an activity. And so that's the weird thing, is like when you're looking for a language to describe an activity, it's really hard to talk about an complete activity, because if it's complete, why is it active? It shouldn't be moving. It shouldn't be unfolding. It's complete, right? Well, on the side of reason, it's to suggest that incompleteness, if it is a feature of reality, cannot be incompleteness in the sense of a nothing. It must be a lack that's a present absence. And the present absence is the future that's absent because it's entirely open, but it's working on the present in that radical openness. And so the future is virtual, it's imagined, but the way that the actual present is unfolding is according to the potentiality that is part of it, as Jockin was saying, that then our ability to choose according to the virtual can impact and change or create the way that it all unfolds. The likelihood of that occurring, though, is relative to our ability to encounter partial objects, and I think is relative to beauty in this entire... Oh, bye, Mr. Winn. Bye, tea time. Is all relative, and I'll give it back to Mr. Jockin because I know you had your hand up. Is this... If we could experience this as beauty, that's the metric of the proper relation, I think, to incompleteness, as this time space. And the incompleteness is simply something we resolute ourselves in that employment. Mr. Jockin.
No, but I appreciate this. I appreciate that. I appreciate what Thomas brought up because he's actually demonstrating how radical our position is, because it's showing how completely it's throwing in the face of the modern project of a lot of our categories.
Not to interrupt, I mean, the issue is, I think in many respects, what you bring to the table with lack from an Aristotelian background. The problem is lack is we're talking about a lack that is situated in a way in Hegel, Lacan, Aristotle, modern and classical. Like that's the kind of move that I think then is a little different, that I do think is valid. And I think it can fit with Hegel. And I think the lack that Lacan is talking about, he didn't want to, I don't think he wanted to make it ontological, just like Chichan is saying. But then when you look at the lack that exists for the subject, this is what we would expect following Aristotle. Like you would expect this given Aristotle. So you don't, from the, dare I say, subject psychoanalytical lack directly get to Aristotle. No, but you ask questions of, okay, if the subject is able to have this experience, this is where the phenomenology of lack is important, the phenomenology of the psychoanalytical. What must the conditions of reality be like so that this kind of lack in psychoanalysis is possible? Oh, well, then there must be ontologically some sort of lack that would make this possible. And that's where you're moving from the to sort of the ontology. Does that make sense of what I'm saying, Mr. Jockin?
No, that makes perfect sense, because that's what I wanted to say, because I wanted to point out, like, that's my contribution talking with you all about this was the whole point of, I use the example constantly of the bridge why did the bridge fall? It lacks support on the left beam. Like the fact that we can give an it can be a cause, it's a causation of an event, something that happened in material reality, and we actually have to use that language to describe what occurred and its causational properties. That tells me that there is some, like, this notion of lack has some ontological aptitudes in some way because of that. But I agree with you. Like, that's kind of the tension, like, that's kind of the drawing of the points. Like, that's the thing, is like, we're not saying that nothing caused the bridge to collapse. That doesn't make any sense. That's kind of I wish Thomas was here to hear that, because that's like my thing I'm positing the strongest in contrast to like traditional accounts. But with that said, I heard the conversation.
No, it's outstanding. To me, this is what you're getting at. To me, again, when I talk about the absolute choice, if the lack in the bridge is objective, I'll just use that language. It has an objective base. Then that poses a question. The subject can decide, hey, what if my lack has an objective base too? The issue, though, is you don't. This is, I guess, why I keep emphasizing the choice. You're not forced by your subjective, I don't know what else to call it, subjective lack. That's actually, you're not forced by your experience of your own lack, see you, Chetan, to interpret it as objective. You're not forced to interpret your psychoanalytical lack as objective. You have to choose to interpret it that way.
Otherwise, the idea of the problem is you get driven by it. If you're not, if you don't choose to be aware of it, you get driven by it. So this idea of Lacan, again, my interpretation of Lacan and lack, the drive, is this, that's the operation of it. Is that if you're not consciously aware of it, you can be unconsciously driven by it.
Yes, that's correct. So it's working on you, but the way that it works on you is relative to your choice. Whereas the bridge doesn't have a choice on how the lack is working on it, right? Like the lack works on it like it does, but the subject seems to have some degree of agency on how their lack works on them. Do we agree with that?
Yeah, basically the hypothetical versus material necessity, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And so what's interesting is that we as a subject can choose, hey, my lack is not nothing. It works on me. Then it has an objective base because it works on you, right? It has some sort of ontological base, but it's a result of a choice. And it's to me, what's interesting, it's this, the choice doesn't give it existence. The choice influences its unfolding.
Well, that's the thing. It's like basically by you becoming aware. It's like, that's the kind of thing. Like I think it's knowing versus awareness. You know, like the awareness of it that's what's drawn. What I'm hearing. Being drawn.
No, that's exactly right. So for me, Whereas the objectivity of the lack of the bridge has nothing to do with awareness, basically. Nothing at all in how it unfolds. Just, you know, the human, the way their lack unfolds, which is actually based in the subject, objective, if you will. It's based in the structure of the subject. We'll just say objective. The lack of the subject is objective, but the way that the subject unfolds relative to the lack is radically, I think fairly radically influenced by how they choose to relate to it.
This actually operates too in the nature of knowledge too.
So for me, to go back to the original discussion we had in the philosophy of glimpses, the problem of scale is actually the ability to get more people to make that choice. Because what I mean when I say, I don't have to convince anyone of anything for the way that the objective lack of the bridge causes the bridge to unfold and how it's going to participate in reality. But the way that the objective lack of the subject unfolds is conditioned by the agency of the subject. And because of that, that's kind of the question of spread in many respects and scales. How could you scale the conditions to increase the probability that more people would choose on their own the acknowledgement of that objective lack so that it unfolds differently according to beauty versus the mistake of lack is not nothing? Because let me explain. I'm of the opinion that the mistake of people thinking that lack is nothing is extremely high if they do not choose to acknowledge the lack. To me, the problem of scale ultimately is spreading the probability that the average person chooses to interpret their objective subjective lack as a present absence versus nothing. Does that make sense?
It does. And that's the whole point about like this kind of the encounter of the surprise.
Yes.
Because that's the point, is that the surprise is that it's that linchpin moment,
Yes.
right? Of you're either going to take it as the nothing or you're going to take it as a lack, right? In terms of this operation we're talking about.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's definitely the like.
And to me, that is ultimately what I mean when I talk about the absolute choice. The absolute choice is the choice on lack as nothing or lack as a present absence. And so the question of scale then is how to spread, which I'm using a little interchangeably here, although in the book later on it makes some distinctions, but if you grant it to me here. The question is, can you scale the conditions to increase the probability that the average person makes the absolute choice that lack is not nothing, which would mean you scale conditions of surprise that people can handle and that they are probable to interpret as lack is not nothing. I'm of the opinion that you can show in the history basically of economics that a society of people that are more likely to do that by whatever language they use creates non-zero sumness versus zero sumness. It creates politics that can follow democracy versus not. It creates pluralism that doesn't become pathological. It creates relationships that are more likely to function, ergo, ergo, ergo. It creates commutative rationality that actually functions. If you go through history, you'll see lack by other language, muse, creativity, innovate. There are different languages that people use to talk about various encounterologies. And what you see is socially when people make the absolute choice, whether they knew they were doing it or not, and they organize themselves according to the lack, then what you see is wealth creation, non-zero sumness versus zero sumness. So you spread the conditions of the making of the absolute choice, which seems to be a situation of encountering surprise. Does that all make sense that we're saying so far?
Yeah, there's no disagreements here.
I
keep piling in because when people go aggressive with the pure subjectivity question, it's just a notion.
Sure.
I'm like, I'm like jumping off the table with that.
Oh, sure. And to me, I only ask because this is the logic of the problem of scale that belonging again to follows. And to me, the thing that makes the absolute choice as such difficult is because the unfolding of the subjective lack is conditioned by choice, which seems like it has a different quality than the unfolding of the objective lack of the bridge. And that's why there seems to be something in a sense different in the objectivity of the lack of the subject versus the objectivity of the lack of the bridge. The difference seems to be the involvement of choice.
Yes, which is rational action.
When I was talking about with the philosophy of glimpses on the idea of the lack of the subject not being objective, what I did not have, it would have been to say that there's a virtual dimension to it, to use that language. And so what it is the objective lack of the subject entails a virtuality that the bridge does not. You know, and so.
Oh no, that's why I said over DM with you.
Yeah, that was really good.
Knowledge is the virtual. It's knowledge is the virtual. That's
that's what it is. Exactly. So here's the issue. The problem of scale is the spreading of a certain virtuality, a certain way of thinking that increases the absolute choice. Because it is virtual, it does not necessarily have to be totalitarian, because it can be in the realm of rhetoric and convincing, right? And since what we are talking about is a virtual relation to limit and lack according to surprise, these seem to be metaphysical material that is available to everyone. It is not it's not contingent upon a certain, everyone, if you're born, you have these metaphysical resources, right? Therefore, in theory, maybe however improbable it might be, in theory, it is not impossible for a spreading of the absolute choice. Does that make sense? That what we said. So in theory, it's not impossible. The question is what exactly, practically now, would incubate an increased probability of the absolute choice being made. And also, to kind of make one more claim on the objectivity, the very fact that it is the virtual in the human lack objectivity that is the differentiating principle from the objective lack of the bridge would suggest the primacy of time in the subjective lack, or the human lack, which then would suggest that there's something about the human subject that is steering time in a way. And this is like the creative act of the human being is some sort of steering of time space almost, but it's not in a power dominion, but a kind of relational growth way, like a stewardship, like a garden way. Like, you know, I can't just will a seed to grow. Likewise, I can't just will for time space to unfold in a certain way. I have to work with the material. It's a kind of co-laboring that kind of exists, right? And to me, this is very interesting because I think basically every Abrahamic religion and even Hinduism and different things basically suggests that the human subject has some sort of co-laboring function.
Synergy, that's the word.
Yeah, a synergy.
Co-opted into corporate talk, but its original meaning was basically the synchronicity of energeia, of energies, right? So your individuated actuality, acting, is to be in synchrony with God, right?
Exactly. And the differentiating factor is that God does not have to create in relation per se. He can do it in himself, right? So that's what makes God God, but humans can create in relation with God or with the time space. But there's a differentiation that means we're not God, because you have that differentiation. That, of course, is an infinite differentiation based on the theological tradition you're going for. But what's so interesting is that this conception, this metaphysical conception, would, of course, be what you would expect given these theological traditions. And then what's interesting with it, then, if we're talking about a spreading of the absolute choice, that would be a spreading of an alignment with God. That would be the spreading of this certain of alignment. Now, I made a theology move there in a kind of sense, but did it make sense?
You can use virtue. You can use virtue ethics.
Yeah.
Actuality. If God, on a presupposition that God is full actuality, and assuming that, then you would say basically virtue is excellence, which is more toward activation, which is under this argument. If God has if our participation with Him is virtue,
yes,
there you go.
Yeah, and so what it would hold it to use it, because that's exactly right. You just say actuality. If actuality is time space, then the spreading of the absolute choice is the spreading of alignment with actuality. And then if you look through history, it's just what all the classics told you. They said, hey, the good life is found in the alignment with actuality. Hey. Yes, if you go through history, that's what you see. When people choose lack as not nothing, the funny thing is, the good life is found in the absolute choice that lack is not nothing. That's the good life, because that's alignment with actuality as time space. And then being as time, if you mean it in that more classical sense, as distinct from existence, right? And so that's what we should expect. You know, that's fitting. That's what's interesting, is it's a conception that's fitting. It's not discovered. It's not created. It's like, this is what you would expect. This is what you would expect. You would expect, in a sense, it is fitting that the human thrives in alignment with actuality. You would not it would not be fitting for the human to thrive in an absence of actuality, right? That would be a privation. That would not be fitting. What is fitting is for the human to find thriving in alignment with the actuality, which then the interesting idea is that I think you can go through history and show that. I think you can show that. The issue is that we basically have not looked at those episodes of history as such because we have not thought that alignment with actuality was the choice of lack is not nothing. We thought it was something else, power or answers or something.
In my mind, also, what I'm seeing here is also a discussion of symmetry. Like, that's the point, is that through an operation of symmetry, that's what's going on here, which gives a kind of justice, right? There's a kind of an ontological justice here that things are accounting for in fittingness by a symmetry of the status of lack. Is that why would somehow, if we did it together, we drew it out, which was, if lack does have causational power in material reality, by material necessity, in the hypothetical state of the subject, why would that not be the case? We need a discussion that's about the virtual, yes, that is, but that point is that virtual, we can make that model represent either symmetrically with the external reality or not. And then we work through the idea of synergy, drawing out the idea of virtue and actuality, right? When things are in actuality and virtuously done, we get in synergy with reality and achieving that to happen. But not by a willful external model being imposed onto reality. It's a very different operation about it.
I think that's really beautifully put. And so human thriving seems to be found in a certain symmetry with actuality. I think that's exactly right. So it's metageometrical, situation, Leibniz, et cetera, so forth. The thing is that we have historically not thought of finding symmetry in a virtual or absolute choice regarding lack. That's not what we've thought. We certainly have not defined society that way. We've tried to locate it in, say, facts or empiricism or, the present, not the present absence. And so what's interesting then is encounter. The encounter seems to be it seems to be a unique probability of the realization of symmetry as such, because that it's inviting the absolute choice. It's kind of wooing you. It's almost like, it's like inviting you to do it. And then there's these classical notions of the wooing of God, the romance, the kind of, pulling in kind of thing. And it's like the encounter, the sacred romance is another, there's a certain wooing in that to make the absolute choice, that lack is not nothing, versus the natural thought. And this might also be why thought is so central, because if you don't think, you're just going to say lack is nothing. Thinking and contemplatio in philosophy seems to be the necessary prerequisite for you to ever think that lack is not nothing. How could you ever choose that lack is not nothing without philosophy? It seems like it would require contemplatio. It would require a certain dwelling to make that decision or to think that. And so then it would make sense that philosophy has some sort of necessity to the good life, to the symmetry of the actuality, the alignment of actuality. What do we think of that?
I'm generally I'm of that opinion.
Yeah.
I'm very much of that opinion. It's kind of it's funny. Actually, I remember philosophy's love of wisdom.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea, ultimately, we come down to a doctrine of love.
Yeah.
That's what we come down to. We realize. So actually, Aquinas talks about this. To love God is superior to know God.
Yeah.
He doesn't. He says that he's saying that because he's pointing out there's something plus extra. There's some addition to that's happening there. So I don't know. I kind of feel like at this point I wish other members in the group were in the call, because at this point I feel like that's kind of I appreciate your preview of basically the address. I appreciate it, because it sounds like this is partly going to be in the address of Belonging in Part 2. Yeah,
this is the whole central kind of meta geometry framework of the whole thing. It's all about the absolute choice and beauty and present absent, absolutely. And just thinking, what would lack mean for political economy? What would lack mean for sociology? Because my argument would be political economy, economics. So if you take lack seriously, then that actually has massive ramifications for political economy, education. And I think it's not just based on a theory, that you can actually go to historic episodes, kind of like Hegel going to historic episodes and other great philosophers. And you see, yes, there's lack here. They are here, right here. Look, this is the Dutch Empire creating so much wealth. Look here. This is when diplomacy worked. Look what they did. And you see the presence of lack there, even if it was not named. And so you see it moving through history in a manner that creates wealth. It's just that perhaps not until this moment has there been a contradiction that has forced looking back and considering these things, seeing what was always there, right? Because that's why Zizek, I think, is correct in the sense of you need to interpret the past. Like, don't try to change the future, interpret the past, which is the act of changing the virtual. That's the key. Like, if you interpret and you learn, you change it. That's how you change the future, by changing the virtual, because that changes how the future unfolds. And I think that's correct. And like, lack is right here in Aristotle, for frick's sake. Goodness, a quiet look at it. And so that, and then what's interesting, I guess I'll close with this, is it's almost like then, it's like lack, because we're talking about love and different things, and it's like the choice to interpret, like if philosophy is the love of wisdom, it's almost like if you love wisdom, you will choose to interpret lack as not nothing. Like, that's the vow in a way. Like, that's the choice. Like, if you love wisdom, then you would choose that lack is not nothing. Otherwise, you don't love wisdom. It's kind of like, that's the marriage kind of thing, right? Like, if you love something, you marry it, right? There's a kind of commitment in that, right? Or a certain commitment. Like, if you love wisdom, you would commit. You know, you would commit to lack. You'd be committed that lack is not nothing. Oh, and by the way, you know what that means? That means you can never finish, because lack is not nothing. Like, that's why it's a kind of like radical choice. Like, there is like, well, if you love wisdom, you would decide that lack is not, you would choose, absolutely choose that lack is not nothing. And boy, howdy, that's a lifetime choice, because the moment you choose that lack is not nothing, that changes your life. It's not a little thing, but you know, love requires that. If you love something, you change your life around it. Because if lack is not nothing and beautiful is lacking in this sense, then it's always wooing you. There's always more beauty to have. There's always more goodness. And if you ever, here's the funny thing. This was, I think, one of the critical parts of the Commedia, where Dante says, kind of as an offline, he kind of goes, if Satan at this point, if I would have turned my head, I would have fallen entire. And basically, it's the idea that if you're this close to the beatific vision and you look away here, you're instantly Satan. Like, instantly, because it would require such an assertion of the will. It's not that you would simply go down a level. No. You would go straight to the bottom of hell if you turned here at the top. And so what's interesting is the moment you say, lack is not nothing. Well, if you ever look away at this point of commitment, well, then the negative consequences could be incredibly dire. And I think that's getting to your symposium talk, where lack is incredibly dangerous. Absolutely it is. And this is where the medieval people were like, careful. And they were right. And we probably weren't ready for it for most of history. We probably weren't ready for it until now, maybe, or maybe there's a danger here of a pride, but that's where the historic episode pushing it seems important, because it's not a kind of pride. Oh, we're ready for lack now. Well, you're screwed if you say that. It's more from a kind of, no, the conditions have pushed it to that place. And that's why philosophy, just like in a romance, like when you start deciding what the other needs or it's time for, then there's presuppositions that destroy the relationship, right? You have to have a timing, you have to have this sense of timing. So it's like, no, that we're reaching the timing of taking on lack, but there's a real danger in it. An incredible danger, because once you say, yeah, lack is not nothing, if you turn away, it has this radical fall that's part of it.
I mean, I apologize, Dan. You should be going. You should be. It's hilarious that we're gone this late. Like everyone, I
love you.
This time, it's like a post-game hilarity. But I will comment. No, it's funny that it's funny because like relativism was said to be the danger, right? Postmodern relativism was like a danger to truth, because then it becomes power games, whatever. It's funny because like this discussion of black is actually drawing out. Oh no, it's actually even more dangerous. This is even more dangerous than relativism, because relativism just basically insulates. It just calls, as Javier made comments, it just insulates and basically just obliterates. It gets just pretense the power to let it just play out the way it wants to, which is nothing new. When Nietzsche was talking about that, whatever. This is something radical. Like I say this is almost nuclear weapon level of danger.
Yep.
And I think my symposium discussion was that exact point. It's like you don't understand like the degree of delusion that can be played out by this. Like the degree of the dangers here are immense, both in terms of like, and also as you said, the demand placed on us. Because you're right. Because generally the argument of when you see a lack is a nothing, you get to just put it away. You get to like put it to the side. Also, I just say this because, by the way, pragmatism comes from pragma. Pragma means the subject of concern. It comes from the Greek for that. I always find that very fascinating. So pragmatism is just saying, don't worry about what you're concerned about right now. Worry about that. Don't worry about this other stuff. Let that work out on its own. So I just want to point out, like, there's some really interesting that the saving power is the greatest danger. Use a Heidegger line. I think it's totally true.
Well, and to me, the problem of scale, this is the issue. It's not in 2-1, but it gets into the issue is that the only way we deal with the problem of scale is basically with lack. That's insanely dangerous, but it's the only thing that can deal with the problem of global pluralism without falling into one of these other addresses. This is also why, though, it would make sense, given the danger of lack, that it is not until this moment in history that it has arisen with a certain necessity to it, given the problem of global pluralism. However, the reason it also makes sense is because until the determinations or the global situation is so bad that basically you would be forced to use lack well, you wouldn't use it well. That's why it probably has something to do with this moment, because at this moment, there's the possibility of the global situation being so bad that you will use lack correctly because the surrounding determinations force it, if you will, or push you into it. Whereas until now, lack could not emerge without being misused, or it just would be misused, because if lack emerges in comfort, Lord have mercy, you know, you see what I'm saying? Like if it emerged in comfort, it seems like it would be a complete recipe for disaster. Whereas if it emerges in the presence of a certain geopolitical meaning crisis, etc., necessity, well, then it's get it right or die, right? It's like do or die kind of thing. Does that make sense, Mr. Jockin?
We don't know yet. We don't know how it's going to play out.
No.
But I will say that, I mean, it's not the first time. Like when Aristotle, when the text of Aristotle, again, this is just my pet topic. When Aristotle got reintroduced into the West, it was a huge problem.
Yeah.
It put these gigantic, because there are doctrinal points in Aristotle that are completely in contradiction to Christian argument, Christian models. So the full assumption was obliterate it, get rid of it, do not incorporate this, do not address it, do not this will destroy our society if we include it in. Aquinas was the one who harmonized it, right? He addressed it, and he brought in as a system and to work with the Christian models at the time. There are questions about that. I mean, one can make an argument in one sense he was absolutely successful at it. In another sense, because of the Reformation that occurred, which in the religious wars, one can make an argument he failed, or at least that project, because a lot of the nominalism came from this. And nominalism was the complete obliteration of a lot of arguments, a lot of the ontological status that grounded Christendom at that time.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is, I would say, what we're in now with this addressing of lack as a category, as an object, is very similar to the Christendom reintroduction of Aristotle writing, or Aristotle Islamic thinking that came up. So I see a similar historical pattern of the two. And how that plays out, it could be successful, it could be a failure. Who knows? We'll find out.
Well, the future is entirely open, and I definitely think history is full of these episodes of an introduction of thinking, maybe too early, maybe not, right? Like there's this question of people ready for it, and it seems like it has to be a messy process. That's just how creativity is. It would seem, to your point, like the meta crisis, which is a term people use, the meta crisis seems to be the only context in which lack can be introduced and the probability not be on the side of destruction or self-effacement, to use that term. Because lack could lead, like what I would argue is that lack can lead to ever pluralizing delusionism, a return of paganism, a return of magical thinking. Lack could just explode. I would say conspiracy, as Map is Indestructible, would say all of these come from lack.
Sorry to interrupt, but just to jump in, I mean, when we talk about what's the crisis, like what's the historical development that's making us have to address it? AI.
Yeah. 100%.
AI, machine learning, this is about the correlational probability. It's I joke in my course, I joke about it. It's the second mode of divination.
Yes.
From Plato.
Yes.
Right? It's literally a divination of signs.
Yes.
That's all it is, to tell the future, to make predictions.
No, that's
this is insanity. Like, this is ironic that our methods of objective epistemology of science has gotten us to basically make divinational signs again. This is horrendously horrifying.
To your point, at the end of 2.1, the argument is that, to use Mr. Luber and Alex's work on story, AI is what is the causer forcing us to make a choice on lack, is going to be the argument. And the theme is what we choose. The theme is the apparent, like, you know, Luber will talk about theme as a command. So lack is the causer that makes the theme arise, and that means the command is the absolute choice. The theme is you have now to make an absolute choice. Lack is either nothing or lack is not nothing. Choose. Time's up. And so that's the causer. And the argument, funny enough, is you could make an argument that there's something about the actual like story of humanity, if you follow like Luber's language, requires a causer. And so there's a way in which the absolute choice regarding lack is, in a sense, a kind of story of humanity, of which is the choice out of irony into the theme. Because irony is where you were like, irony is like treating lack as nothing, which you can do because it is actually lack. So if you interpret it as nothing, it works on you still. That's irony, right? So the idea is the reason why you can say lack is nothing wrongly, but you can believe it is because it's lacking. So it's not going to stop you. And it has causal impact on you to thus make it seem that way. And that's irony. X does Y for Z, and Y is why you don't get Z. So we have emphasized nothing to free us from the problems of totalitarianism and bad philosophy and the Enlightenment. And that has been ironic because it hasn't done it, right? And yet we keep doing it and we go into a circle. Well, then the causer emerges of AI that forces you to go, hey, you're going to have to make that absolute choice finally. Like, if you make it, it's done. Okay, lack is nothing. You're nothing then. Or you never leave the irony, which would be a tragedy in this sense. Or the causer says, no, you have to, the theme is unveiling the absolute choice. Lack is nothing or lack is not nothing. Choose. And the story would be choosing the comedy, the ascension, the happy ending would be the choice that lack is nothing. But it would have to have arisen in, here's the key. Without the causer, the likelihood of making the absolute choice in a non-self-effacing way is low. The causer greatly increases the probability that you make the absolute choice on the side of the comedy versus the tragedy, per se, on the side of lack is not nothing, and you don't fall into all of these pathologies. But you need the causer. And this is why I think you see a kind of repetitiveness to history without there being a forcedness. History seems to require the emergence of the causer, but the causer in all of its various forms, I do think AI is unique as a causer because of the extremity by which it forces the choice. And you have to clearly identify lack, not just do a diversion of it, a substitute of it that you don't know is lack, if you know what I'm saying. So it's a very clear, it clearly formulates the theme, right? In what AI does, that as the causer then forces you to make the choice, which then had to have had history get to this point of the meta crisis. You had to have had a certain kind of repetition of mistakes so that the causer could arise, right? But here's the key. The repetition is a function of the opportunity of the causer and the absolute choice, not a sort of fate. You see what I'm saying? Like the repetition is not a certain inescapableness. The repetition is a reappearance of the opportunity for the absolute choice. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be new patterns that arise with the absolute choice, of course, but there's a way in which the pattern keeps patterning until the absolute choice is made in a comedy form. That lack is not nothing, but it's understandable why that choice has not been historically fitting until now, because it's too dangerous. And it's certainly too dangerous before there's a causer, right? Like it's especially too dangerous before you go, oh, wait. And I think we see what happened, and I'll give it to you, is like people just ever pluralize into cheap delusionism with lack, or they ever like lack is conspiracy. Lack creates the possibility of all of the pathologies, but it is also the invitation to the beauty. And that's why then it also makes sense that like the love of wisdom requires this choice. And it's a commitment. It's a real commitment. And I guess you could say in this sense that the love of wisdom is now kind of possible. Like in its deepest sense, the causer of AI kind of allows a certain quality to the love of wisdom that may not have been possible before. That is of a kind of profound quality precisely because it comes with the risk of Lucifer, per se, the fall of it comes with the risk of this certain danger. But that's precisely why it has the possibility of a certain beautification, Like there's a possibility of a beautification that may not have been possible before due to the cause.
It's ironic because again, like the irony of it all is the return of virtue. It's, and again, in my account,
the return of virtue.
It's shown up because both in terms of its account of fluency, right? So on that account, but also in this idea of like we have to participate in this and perfect and easily get in more the idea that we need to embody our souls to be able to withstand this demand, right? That's kind of a virtue ethics orientation, an idea of cultivation of the soul to be able to encounter this, to be able to make that ultimate choice, as you said, to basically see lack as not nothing.
Yeah.
So it requires commitments on yourself, right?
Yeah.
It requires an immense amount of commitments.
Yes. No, absolutely. And that's to me where, and then the other key is in psychoanalysis, like Lacan and all of those, humans, the worst of human beings tend to come out in love and relationships, not in like seclusion. Like the worst of human beings come out. So it would make sense that like loving wisdom is tied precisely into the moments where the worst of history can come out or the worst of people can come out. But that's also why the possibility of the purgatory, like the beauty is also there. Like the best of things are tied. Like you can only become a demon in this sense if you're in heaven, right? Because you have to fall to follow that kind of Christian conception of falling, right? So you have to have a certain ascension to have the possibility of the worst. And that though, and that seems to be tied to this choice, this absolute choice of being committed to lack is not nothing. And I'm committed to that. And that's the commitment of loving wisdom, of which then can gather you, it can work and can condition yourself under as forced by the culture of AI. I enjoy speaking to you.
I never hear a one-to-one conversation. You better go, Dan. You got things to work on.
Yeah, I know. I'm screwed. I'm screwed at this point. It's always a pleasure, sir. I enjoyed it. And you've always helped me think through these matters, and I would not be able to think through them without you. And I appreciate your scholarship profoundly.
A friendship and virtue is no better in the words of Aristotle.
Absolutely. Aristotle is on it. Mr. Jockin, always a pleasure, sir.